On the day of my wife's sister's wedding, I found my photo at the gate with a sign, "Do not let the poor in-law in." I turned and left in silence. For hours later, she realized her wedding had ended. When I went home, so there I was, pulling up to what had to be the most Instagram-perfect wedding venue in the entire tri-state area. I'm talking about one of those places that charge you $50 just to breathe their artisanal oxygen. White tents stretched under these massive oak trees that probably cost more to maintain than my annual salary. And there was this stone archway absolutely drowning in roses that looked like they'd been individually blessed by Martha Stewart herself. The whole setup screamed, "We have more money than sense," which, knowing my in-laws, was pretty much their family motto. This was Talia's big day, my wife Sophie's younger sister, the golden child who could literally set fire to an orphanage and still get praised for her creative spirit. I'd been mentally preparing for this circus for months, and honestly, I was ready to play my part. Help set up chairs, carry things, smile at distant relatives who'd inevitably ask what I do for work, with that special tone reserved for people they suspect might not own a yacht. I straightened my jacket, the good one I'd bought specifically for this event, because God forbid I show up in something from Target, and took a deep breath. The place smelled like expensive perfume, and that particular brand of entitlement that comes with having a trust fund. Guests were already floating around like they were auditioning for a Real Housewives episode, all polished shoes and designer handbags that cost more than my car payment. That's when I spotted Leo, the security guard they'd hired for the event. Now, Leo seemed like a decent enough guy, the kind of working-class dude who probably thought this whole production was as ridiculous as I did. But when he stepped directly into my path, clipboard in hand, I knew something was off. The way he looked at me, like he was about to deliver the world's most uncomfortable news, made my stomach drop. "Sorry, sir," he said, and I could tell he really was sorry. Poor bastard was just doing his job. Then he pointed to his clipboard, and I swear to God, time slowed down like I was in some twisted movie scene. There, clipped to the top of his official wedding security paperwork, was my photograph. Not a good one, either. It looked like they'd pulled it from my Facebook profile, the one where I'm squinting because Sophie took it right after I'd been staring at my phone screen for 3 hours. But the photo wasn't the worst part. Oh no, that honor belonged to the text underneath it, printed in bold, unmistakable letters. "Do not let the poor in-law in." For a moment, I honestly thought I was hallucinating. Maybe I'd had a stroke in the parking lot. Maybe this was some elaborate prank, and someone was going to jump out with a camera and tell me I'd been punked. But Leo's increasingly uncomfortable expression told me this was real. This was actually happening. The silence that followed was the kind you only experience right before a tornado hits. Even the birds seemed to shut up, like Mother Nature herself was holding her breath to see how this train wreck would unfold. Meanwhile, guests continued their elegant parade past us, wrapped in clouds of perfume that probably cost more per ounce than gold. A few of them glanced in my direction, took in the scene. Me standing there like an idiot, Leo clutching his clipboard like a life preserver, and then quickly looked away with that practiced indifference rich people use when they encounter anything unpleasant. That my brain was still trying to process what I was seeing when muscle memory kicked in. I pulled out my phone and called Sophie, because surely this had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe someone had mixed up the clipboards. Maybe this was meant for some other poor in-law. Though honestly, what kind of family has multiple poor in-laws they need to ban from weddings? "Sophie," I said when she picked up, and I could hear the sound of champagne glasses clinking and people laughing in the background. "There's been some kind of mix-up here. The security guard has my picture with instructions not to let me in because I'm the poor in-law." There was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds too long. 3 seconds that told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. "Marcus," she whispered, and I could tell she was trying to move somewhere more private. "Please don't start. Today is not about you. Not about me." I was staring at my own face on a blacklist, and somehow this wasn't about me. But before I could even begin to unpack that particular piece of logic, she hung up. Just like that. Click. Dial tone. End of conversation. I stood there for another moment, phone still pressed to my ear like maybe she'd call back and explain that this was all some hilarious misunderstanding. Like maybe she'd say, "Oh my God, Marcus, I can't believe my family is this stupid. Come in, we'll fix this right now." But that call didn't come. Instead, I got to taste that metallic flavor that fills your mouth right before you either throw up or punch something. It's the taste of humiliation mixed with rage, seasoned with a generous helping of disbelief. I'd experienced it before, usually during family dinners when my father-in-law would make his little comments about people who work with their hands, or when my mother-in-law would ask if I was still doing that little job of yours. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was calculated. Someone had taken the time to print out my picture, write those words, and attach it to official wedding security instructions. Someone had looked at my face and decided I wasn't worthy of being in the same space as their precious guests. That I looked at Leo, who was clearly wishing he was anywhere else in the world. Poor guy was probably making minimum wage to deal with this kind of rich people drama. I nodded at him. Not his fault, just following orders, and said, "No worries, man. I get it." And then I did something that probably shocked everyone who knew me. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I didn't demand to speak to the manager or threaten to call my lawyer. I just turned around, walked back to my car with as much dignity as I could muster, and drove away. Very, very calmly. Because sometimes, when people show you exactly who they are, the best thing you can do is believe them. And what my wife's family had just shown me was that they considered me such a liability, such an embarrassment, that they'd rather ban me from the wedding than risk having their guests see me and realize they'd let their daughter marry down. Well, message received, loud and clear as I drove away from that perfect venue with its perfect tints and perfect roses. I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. Because for the first time in years, I knew exactly where I stood with these people. And it turned out, I didn't stand anywhere at all. The drive home was one of those weird, out-of-body experiences where you're going through the motions of normal life while your brain is basically screaming into the void. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, maintained a respectable speed, used my turn signals like a law-abiding citizen, all while replaying the last few months in my head like some masochistic highlight reel. See, here's the thing about being the poor in-law that nobody talks about. You become invisible in the most spectacular way possible. You're there, you're helping, you're doing stuff, but somehow it all gets attributed to family effort or everyone pitching in. It's like being a ghost who pays bills and moves furniture. Take last month, for instance. Margaret, that's my delightful mother-in-law, had called me at 7 in the morning, practically hyperventilating because the rental company had screwed up the table delivery. Did she call her precious daughter Talia? Nope. Did she call her husband Harlan, who supposedly knows people in the event business? Hell no. She called me, because somehow I'd become the family's unofficial crisis manager, so there I was, spending my Saturday morning driving to 3 different rental places, sweet-talking managers, and basically performing miracles to make sure Princess Talia had the exact shade of ivory table she'd seen in some wedding magazine. And when I finally got it sorted, Margaret told everyone at dinner that she'd handled the table situation. Like I was just the Uber driver who happened to be in the area. Or how about the time 2 weeks ago when the photographer's backup equipment got stolen from his car? Guess who got the panicked phone call at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday? Not the bride's wealthy parents who could have easily covered new equipment. Me. Because apparently, I'm the go-to guy for small emergencies, which is rich people speak for problems that require actual money and effort to solve. I'd driven across town to meet Hollis Reed, the photographer, at a 24-hour camera shop, helped him pick out replacement gear, and put it on my credit card because his insurance wouldn't kick in until the next week. Did anyone thank me at the family dinner that Sunday? Well, Harlan did mention that the photography situation had been handled smoothly, which I guess was his way of acknowledging my existence without actually acknowledging my existence. The really beautiful part was the suit situation. 3 weeks ago, Harlan had called me in a panic because his tuxedo rental was all wrong. Apparently, the place had given him something more appropriate for a prom in 1987 than his daughter's wedding. So naturally, I dropped everything, picked him up, and spent 4 hours driving around to different formal wear places until we found something that met his standards. 4 hours. On a workday. Which meant I had to use vacation time to help my father-in-law not look like a reject from a bad romantic comedy. And the whole time he's going on about how these service people don't understand quality, how back in his day, you could count on businesses to get things right the first time. The irony of him complaining about service while I was literally providing him with unpaid chauffeur and personal shopping services was apparently lost on him. But it wasn't just the big stuff. It was the endless parade of small favors that added up to me basically being their unpaid personal assistant. Emergency hotel bookings when their out-of-town guests realized that staying in Manhattan during wedding season was going to cost them more than a small car. Backup transportation when the shuttle service tried to jack up their prices at the last minute. Hell, I'd even paid for Margaret's hair and makeup trial runs because the salon required a deposit and she'd forgotten her wallet. Every single time, it was the same story. Marcus is so resourceful. They'd say, like being resourceful was some kind of charming personality quirk instead of code for the guy who solves our problems with his own money and time. I wasn't resourceful. I was their safety net, the person they could count on to catch whatever expensive problem came falling down. And the whole time, they'd make these little comments. Nothing directly insulting. Mind you, they were too classy for that. Just these casual observations about how different our backgrounds were. How interesting it must be for me to experience their world. How lucky Sophie was that I was so adaptable. Every conversation was a masterclass in passive-aggressive condescension disguised as inclusion. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd mentally cataloged every single thing I'd done for this wedding over the past year. The running around, the emergency fixes, the deposits, the favors, the smile and nod sessions while they talked about me like I was some fascinating anthropological specimen they'd decided to adopt. That I sat in my car for a minute, staring at my house. My normal, middle-class house in my normal, middle-class neighborhood where nobody gave a damn about the thread count of your sheets or whether your watch was expensive enough to be taken seriously. It looked pretty good right about now. Inside, I went straight to my office and called Monique Alvarez, my accountant. Monique was one of those no-nonsense women who could make sense of any financial mess and wasn't impressed by anyone's family drama. If you wanted straight answers about money, she was your person. "Marcus," she said when she picked up, "please tell me you're not calling about more wedding expenses. I'm starting to think you're funding this thing single-handedly. Actually, Monique, I need you to run through the final balances for everything we've got tied up in this wedding." I could hear her pulling up files on her computer. Oh boy. Okay, let's see what we're looking at here. She started reading down the list, and with each item, I felt this weird sense of clarity washing over me. Chef Anton Catering. I'd covered their deposit when the family's check bounced, and they needed to secure the booking. Hollis Reed Photography. That was the equipment replacement plus his retainer fee. Priya Kapoor Floral. I'd paid her rush fee when Talia decided 3 days before the wedding that she needed completely different centerpieces. Then there was Jasper Miles and the Night Owls, the band that was supposed to keep everyone dancing until midnight. Bluebell Transit for the shuttle service. The venue's closing balance with manager Ms. Duarte. The temporary event liquor license that was, for reasons I still didn't understand, filed under my name. And the generator fuel on my commercial account with Oscar Power Services, because apparently, the venue's backup power wasn't reliable enough for the precious celebration. All deposits are paid, Monique continued, and final payments are scheduled for Monday on your authorization. Insurance binder is issued through your policy, generator fuel account is active, and the liquor license expires Tuesday. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time all day, I smiled. Not a happy smile. More like the smile you get when you suddenly understand the punchline to a really dark joke. "Monique," I said, "I need you to pause all my authorizations. Every single one." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "Pause them. Marcus, the wedding is today. If anyone asks why, tell them to speak to the bride's family. They made it very clear today that my presence isn't welcome at their celebration." I could practically hear her raising an eyebrow. What did they do? Let's just say they've decided I'm not their kind of people. Got it. Consider everything paused. You want me to send notifications? Just to the vendors. Let them know authorization has been withdrawn and they need to contact the bride's family for payment arrangements. After I hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, looking out at my backyard where everything was exactly as messy and imperfect as real life should be. And then I waited for the silence to do its work. I grabbed a notebook from my desk drawer, one of those composition books I used to use for project planning back when I thought being organized would somehow earn me respect in this family. The irony wasn't lost on me. I opened it to a fresh page and started writing down numbers, because sometimes you need to see the full picture laid out in black and white before you can really grasp just how spectacular your situation has become. The thing about being the family's unofficial problem solver is that you start keeping track of stuff without even realizing it. Not because you're planning to use it against anyone, but because when you're the person everyone calls when things go sideways, you develop this weird mental filing system. You remember dates, amounts, who said what, who promised what, and who conveniently forgot what. So I started with the obvious stuff, the big-ticket items that Monique had just run through with me. But then I kept going, digging deeper into the rabbit hole of small favors that had somehow become my second job over the past year. There was Harlan's tux situation, which hadn't just been about finding a replacement. No, that would have been too simple. After we'd spent 4 hours finding the perfect formal wear, he'd mentioned, casually, like it was no big deal, that he was a little short on the rental fee because he'd had some unexpected expenses that month. Translation: he'd blown his discretionary income on something stupid and needed me to cover his clothing for his own daughter's wedding. $650, because apparently, when you're playing the part of distinguished father of the bride, you can't just rent any old tux. Then there was Margaret's beauty situation. The hair and makeup trials weren't just about finding the right look. They were about finding the right look at the right salon that met her impossibly specific standards. We're talking about a woman who returned a perfectly good lipstick because the shade was too optimistic for her complexion. 3 different salons, 5 different trial runs, and every time I was the one putting down the deposit because they required payment up front, and she always seemed to be between credit card cycles or some other conveniently timed financial hiccup. But here's where it gets really good. The backup tent. 3 weeks before the wedding, there'd been some weather report about possible storms, and suddenly Margaret was having visions of her precious outdoor ceremony getting rained out. Never mind that the venue had covered areas and contingency plans. She needed a backup tent. Not just any tent, mind you, but one that would complement the aesthetic vision and not look like we were hosting a carnival. So I'd spent 2 days calling around to rental companies, comparing prices, checking availability, and eventually putting down a deposit on a tent that cost more than most people's monthly rent. A tent that, as it turned out, was never needed because the weather was perfect. Did I get that deposit back? Well, technically yes, but only after I agreed to let them keep a cancellation fee that was basically highway robbery with a bow on top. The emergency hotel situation was another masterpiece of family logistics. Apparently, when you're planning a wedding in the New York area and you don't book accommodations until the last minute, you discover that hotel prices during peak wedding season are approximately equivalent to the cost of a small space mission. Who knew? So when their out-of-town relatives started calling in a panic because they couldn't find anywhere to stay that wouldn't require them to take out a second mortgage, guess who got to play travel agent? I'd spent an entire weekend calling hotels, negotiating rates, and putting blocks of rooms on my credit card because the relatives couldn't guarantee their arrivals and hotels wanted secured bookings. 6 rooms at the Marriott, 4 at the Hampton Inn, and 2 suites at some boutique place that Margaret insisted was more appropriate for family than the perfectly fine chain hotels I'd originally found. 12 rooms total, 3 nights each, all guaranteed on my personal credit because heaven forbid the precious relatives should have to deal with the stress of securing their own accommodations. Then there was the shuttle service drama. The original company they'd booked had tried to jack up their prices 2 weeks before the wedding, claiming there'd been some kind of miscommunication about the distance and timing. Classic bait-and-switch nonsense, except instead of telling them to pound sand and finding a different company, the family had just assumed I'd handle it, which I did, because apparently, I'm an idiot with a hero complex. I'd negotiated with 3 different transportation companies, compared routes and timing, and ultimately booked with Bluebell Transit because they offered the best combination of reliability and cost. Of course, they required a 50% deposit up front, and of course, the family was temporarily cash poor due to other wedding expenses. The beautiful part was that none of this stuff ever got discussed at family dinners or planning meetings. It all happened in private phone calls and emergency texts, like some kind of shadow wedding that was running parallel to the official celebration. The official version was all about flower arrangements and seating charts and whether the string quartet should play Pachelbel or something more contemporary during the processional. The unofficial version, my version, was about making sure there was enough backup power to keep the lights on, enough transportation to get everyone where they needed to go, and enough contingency planning to handle every possible disaster that might threaten the perfect day they'd all been imagining. That I wrote it all down, every number, every favor, every time I dropped everything to solve someone else's problem. The running total was honestly staggering, not just in terms of money, but in terms of time and effort and sheer emotional labor. I'd basically been moonlighting as an unpaid wedding planner for the past year, handling all the boring, stressful, expensive stuff while they got to focus on the fun parts. And the whole time, they'd been making their little jokes about me being the resourceful one, the guy who could always figure something out, the person they could count on to handle whatever came up. They'd made it sound like some kind of charming character trait, like I was just naturally good at solving problems instead of being someone who'd been systematically recruited to solve their problems. Looking at the numbers laid out in my notebook, I realized something that should have been obvious months ago. I wasn't planning revenge here. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone or teach them some kind of lesson. I was just tired of being taken for granted, tired of being the family's emergency contact for anything that required actual work or actual money. If I wasn't welcome as a person, if my presence was so embarrassing that they needed to post my picture at the gate like I was some kind of security threat, then my wallet wasn't welcome either. It was really that simple. That I wasn't asking for gratitude or recognition or even basic respect. I was just stepping back from a dynamic that had turned me into the family's unpaid staff member. If they wanted to treat me like hired help, they could start by actually hiring help. I finished writing down the last few numbers and closed the notebook. Then I started drafting some very polite emails to the vendors, because there's something to be said for maintaining your dignity, even when you're pulling the plug on someone else's perfect day. The funny thing about being the invisible man at a wedding is that you get to see how everything really works behind the scenes. While everyone else is obsessing over flower arrangements and whether the bridesmaids' dresses are the right shade of blush, you're dealing with the nuts and bolts that actually make the whole production possible. You learn about permits and insurance policies and backup generators, the unglamorous stuff that keeps the party running but never gets mentioned in the thank you speeches. When I decided to step back from my role as the family's unpaid logistics coordinator, I knew exactly which switches to flip. And the beautiful thing was, I didn't have to do anything dramatic or vindictive. I just had to stop doing things. Sometimes the most powerful action you can take is simply not acting. I settled into my kitchen chair with my laptop and started sending out what had to be the most polite, go screw yourselves messages in the history of wedding planning. Nothing nasty, nothing petty, just straightforward business communications letting people know that authorization had changed hands. Professional courtesy at its finest. The first email went to Ms. Duarte, the venue manager, a woman who'd been dealing with bridezillas and their families for probably longer than I'd been alive. She knew the drill. Weddings bring out the worst in people, and vendor payments are usually the first casualty when family drama starts flying. Dear Ms. Duarte, I typed, effective immediately, please direct all authorization requests and final payment arrangements to the bride's family. My role in the financial oversight of this event has concluded. Thank you for your professionalism throughout this process. Short, sweet, and about as diplomatic as a nuclear weapon. Then I moved on to the catering situation. Chef Anton had been a pleasure to work with, the kind of guy who actually understood that feeding 200 people without poisoning anyone requires precision, planning, and payment up front. His deposit had been sitting in limbo for 2 months while the family debated whether they wanted the salmon or the chicken, and I'd been the one guaranteeing that he'd get paid regardless of their indecision. Chef Anton, I wrote, please coordinate all remaining payments and final arrangements directly with the bride's family. My authorization for catering expenses has been withdrawn. I'm confident you'll provide excellent service as always. I hit send and immediately felt this weird sense of lightness, like I'd just set down a suitcase I'd been carrying for way too long. The band was next. Jasper Miles and the Night Owls were supposed to keep everyone dancing until midnight, assuming someone actually paid them. Jazz musicians aren't exactly known for their flexible payment terms, and Jasper had made it clear from the beginning that the final balance needed to be settled before they'd start setting up equipment. Hi Jasper, I typed, hope you and the band are ready for a great show tonight. Please note that all payment coordination should now go through the bride's family directly. My financial involvement has ended. Break a leg out there. By the time I finished working through my vendor list, it was already past 3 in the afternoon. The wedding ceremony was supposed to start at 4, which meant people were probably already arriving at the venue, finding their seats, checking their phones for those perfect pre-ceremony selfies. The bride was probably in her getting-ready suite, surrounded by bridesmaids and champagne, and all the nervous excitement that comes with thinking your wedding day is going to be the most perfect day of your life. That's when my phone started buzzing. 3:20 p.m. Ms. Duarte, sounding slightly panicked. Mr. Marcus, we need to refresh the insurance binder before we can open the dance floor for the reception. The policy expires at 6 p.m., and we need updated coverage for the evening events. I listened to her voicemail and felt that same weird sense of calm I'd experienced driving away from the venue. Ms. Duarte, I called back. My insurance coverage for this event has been withdrawn. You'll need to coordinate new coverage with the bride's family. There was a pause that lasted about 3 heartbeats too long. Sir, are you certain? We can't operate the reception without proper insurance coverage. I'm absolutely certain. Have a lovely day. 3:40 p.m. Text from the bar manager, a guy named Rick who'd been dealing with wedding booze drama for probably 20 years. Hey Marcus, your name is on the liquor permit as the responsible party. Just confirming everything's still valid for tonight's service? I texted back. Authorization withdrawn. Contact bride's family for new permit arrangements. My phone immediately rang. Dude, what do you mean withdrawn? We can't serve alcohol without a valid permit, and yours is the only one on file. That's correct, I said. You'll need a new permit from someone else. But the ceremony starts in 20 minutes. Yes, it does. Good luck with that. 3:55 p.m. Oscar from the generator company, calling from what sounded like the cab of his truck. Marcus, my man, just pulling up to the venue now. Fuel release is on your account, right? Want to make sure we're good to go before I start the hookup. Actually, Oscar, that account authorization has been canceled. You'll need to get payment approval from someone else. Canceled? Today? Brother, I've got a truck full of diesel and a crew ready to set up. You can't just cancel on the day of the event. I'm not canceling anything, I said. I'm just no longer authorizing payment. There's a difference. I could hear him muttering something that probably wasn't appropriate for mixed company. So what am I supposed to do with this fuel? I'd suggest talking to the people who actually wanted the generator. Have a good one, Oscar. By 4:10 p.m., the dominoes were starting to fall in exactly the way I'd expected. When you've been the invisible backbone of an operation for long enough, you develop a pretty clear understanding of how quickly things can unravel when that backbone suddenly disappears. The bar closing was the first real sign that my little paper revolution was working. Nothing dramatic, just Rick putting up a discreet sign and starting to pack away bottles. Can't serve alcohol without a permit, and getting a new permit on a Saturday afternoon is about as likely as finding a unicorn that does taxes. 4:18 p.m. My phone buzzed with a text from Jasper. Got word we need to hold off on setup until payment situation gets sorted. Band's staying ready, but equipment stays in the truck for now. Perfect. Musicians are smart that way. They've been screwed over by enough wedding planners to know that promises don't pay rent. No payment authorization means no music, which means no dancing, which means the reception just became a very expensive dinner party with increasingly awkward silences. 4:26 p.m. Ms. Duarte again, this time sounding like she was dealing with a full-scale emergency. Mr. Marcus, the family is saying they need time to arrange new payment methods. Can you give us any kind of temporary authorization just to get through the evening? I'm afraid not, I said. My involvement in this event has ended. Sir, we have 200 guests expecting a full reception. The cake cutting is scheduled for 6 p.m. That sounds like something the people who plan this reception should handle. By 4:30, the wind had picked up enough to make the white tent flap like a surrender flag, which felt appropriate. Through my kitchen window, I could see my neighbor mowing his lawn, completely oblivious to the 5-alarm wedding emergency that was probably unfolding about 20 miles away. I made myself another cup of tea and settled in to wait for the phone calls I knew were coming. Because when you've been the family's emergency solution for as long as I had, people tend to assume you'll always be available to save the day. They were about to learn that assumption had just become spectacularly wrong. The first call came at exactly 4:37 p.m., and I knew it was Sophie before I even looked at the caller ID. There's something about the timing of panic that's completely predictable. It takes about 27 minutes for wedding chaos to filter up from the vendors, to the venue management, to the wedding planner, to the family. And then someone finally remembers that maybe they should call the guy whose name is on all the paperwork. When I answered, the noise hit me like a physical force. It wasn't just conversation. It was that particular brand of barely controlled chaos that happens when a large group of well-dressed people suddenly realizes their expensive party is falling apart in real time. I could hear chairs scraping against the ground, multiple conversations happening at volume levels that suggested panic, and what sounded like someone crying in the background. "What did you do?" Sophie shouted, and I had to hold the phone away from my ear because she was practically screaming. "Marcus, what the hell did you do? They're saying we can't serve anything. The band is packing up their equipment. The bar is closed. The venue manager is asking for a credit card that we don't have, and everyone keeps saying they need your confirmation for everything. What is happening?" I took a sip of my tea and looked out at my perfectly quiet street, where the most dramatic thing happening was Mrs. Chun walking her little terrier. The contrast was almost surreal. Total chaos 20 miles away, complete peace in my kitchen. "Well," I said, keeping my voice calm and measured, "about 4 hours ago, I arrived at your sister's wedding venue where I discovered that someone had printed out my photograph and attached it to security instructions with the words, 'Do not let the poor in-law in' written underneath it. So I respected that boundary. I left. And since I'm apparently not welcome as a person, I figured my money probably wasn't welcome either." There was a moment of silence on Sophie's end, which was impressive considering the level of noise in the background. Then she came back with what had to be the most tone-deaf response in the history of marital communication. "Marcus, you're being ridiculous. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. You know how my family is with their jokes. You can't punish everyone because you got your feelings hurt." Got my feelings hurt. Like I was some oversensitive child who couldn't take a joke instead of a grown man who'd just been publicly humiliated by his own in-laws. "Sophie," I said, "putting someone's picture on a blacklist isn't a joke. It's a decision. And I'm simply responding to that decision by making one of my own. But people are asking about insurance and permits and payments, and no one knows what to do. I'd suggest they figure it out the same way they figured out how to make that sign." That's when the volume on her end went up another notch, and I realized she was probably standing in the middle of the reception area where everyone could hear her side of the conversation. Perfect. Nothing like having your family drama broadcast to 200 wedding guests. "Marcus, please," she said, and now there was real desperation in her voice. "Just turn everything back on. We can talk about this later. Just fix this so Talia can have her wedding." "Talia is having her wedding," I said. "She's just not having the wedding that I was paying for." That's when she hung up on me. Again. Apparently, hanging up on people was the family's go-to conflict resolution strategy. That MY phone was quiet for exactly 6 minutes before it started ringing again. This time it was Talia, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. Between the sobs and the hiccups, I managed to piece together something about how I was ruining the most important day of her life. And how could I be so cruel? And didn't I understand that this was her wedding? "Talia," I said gently, because despite everything, I didn't actually hate the kid. "I'm not ruining your wedding. Your wedding ended for me the moment someone decided I wasn't good enough to attend it." "But Marcus," she sobbed, "it wasn't my idea. I didn't know about the sign. Mom and Dad handled all the security stuff." Which was interesting, because it meant she was willing to throw her parents under the bus to save her reception, but she wasn't willing to actually do anything about the situation. Like maybe calling her parents and telling them to fix what they'd broken. "I understand it wasn't your idea," I said, "but it was someone's idea, and that someone is responsible for dealing with the consequences. You have to fix this. The cake cutting is in an hour, and there's no music, and people are asking what's wrong," and that's when the phone got grabbed away from her, because suddenly I was listening to Margaret's voice, and she was using that particular tone that rich white women deploy when they're talking to someone they consider beneath them but need something from. "Marcus," she said, like she was addressing a particularly slow child, "I don't know what kind of tantrum you think you're throwing, but this is neither the time nor the place. You are being incredibly selfish, and you need to stop this nonsense immediately." Tantrum, nonsense, selfish, the holy trinity of condescending dismissal. "Margaret," I said, I'm sitting in my kitchen drinking tea. I'm not throwing anything. I'm simply not funding an event where I'm not welcome. Don't be dramatic. It was a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. A misunderstanding, I repeated. Someone printed my picture, wrote, "Do not let the poor in-law in" underneath it, and gave it to security. That's a pretty specific misunderstanding. It was meant to be humorous. Humor, I said, is supposed to be funny. This was just cruel. You're punishing everyone because you can't take a joke. And there it was. The same argument Sophie had tried. The same complete inability to understand that what they'd done wasn't a harmless prank, but a deliberate humiliation. They genuinely seemed to believe that as long as they called it a joke, they could say or do whatever they wanted without consequences. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm simply not subsidizing people who think it's funny to put a slur under my picture. There's a difference. A slur? Don't you think you're being a little overdramatic? Margaret, what would you call it when someone posts a sign saying, "Don't let the poor in-law in"? I'd call it a family joke that you're taking way too seriously. I looked out my window again, where everything was still perfectly normal and quiet. Mr. Rodriguez was washing his car. A couple of kids were riding bikes down the sidewalk. Normal people living normal lives. Not one of them worried about whether they were poor enough to be banned from family events. You know what, Margaret? You're absolutely right. It is a family joke. And now the family gets to figure out how funny it really is. I could hear her saying something else, probably about how unreasonable I was being, but I'd stopped listening. Instead, I was thinking about all the times over the past year when I dropped everything to solve their problems. All the times they called me resourceful, when what they really meant was useful. All the casual comments about my background and my job and my different perspective on things, they'd made their position clear. I was the poor in-law, someone to be tolerated but not respected, someone whose money was welcome but whose presence was embarrassing. Well, message received. And my response was equally clear. If I wasn't good enough to be family, I wasn't going to keep paying to pretend I was. The phone was still squawking in my ear, but I was done listening to explanations about family jokes and misunderstandings. I'd heard all I needed to hear. Margaret, I said, cutting her off mid-sentence, I hope you have a lovely evening figuring out how to fund the rest of this celebration. I'm sure it'll be educational. And then I hung up, turned off my phone, and went to make myself a sandwich. Because apparently, I was going to miss dinner. The rest of the evening was blissfully quiet. I turned my phone off after the Margaret conversation, made myself a decent sandwich, and settled in to watch a baseball game like it was any other Saturday night. The Yankees were playing the Red Sox, which seemed appropriate. Sometimes you just need to watch someone else's rivalry to put your own family drama in perspective. Around 7:30, I started hearing text notifications pinging on my silenced phone, but I ignored them. Whatever crisis was unfolding at the wedding venue, they'd made it clear I wasn't welcome to be part of the solution. So I wasn't going to torture myself by following the play-by-play of their disaster. I was just settling into the 8th inning when headlights swept across my front windows. Not unusual. My neighbors come and go at all hours. But then the lights didn't move on. They just sat there, pointing at my house like spotlights at a prison break that I looked out through the blinds and had to blink a couple of times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. There, lined up on my front walk like some kind of formal delegation, stood Sophie, Talia, Margaret, Harlan, and Jonah. The groom himself, still in his tuxedo, but looking like he'd been through a blender. Hair wilted, makeup smeared, eyes red from what I assumed was a combination of crying and sheer frustration. They looked like refugees from an expensive disaster, which I guess is exactly what they were. I took my time getting to the door. No point in rushing. They'd obviously driven all the way over here, so they could wait another 30 seconds while I decided how I wanted to handle this little intervention. Through the peephole, I could see them trying to organize themselves into some kind of formation, like they were planning a military operation instead of a conversation. When I finally opened the door, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Not bad smells, exactly, but the lingering scent of expensive perfume mixed with wedding cake, and that particular brand of desperation that comes from watching your perfect day implode in real time. Talia was still in her wedding dress, which had to be uncomfortable as hell, and there were grass stains on the hem that suggested she'd been doing some serious problem-solving in high heels. "Marcus," Harlan said, stepping forward like he'd been elected spokesperson for the group. He was trying for his usual authoritative tone, but there was something deflated about him, like someone had let the air out of his normal pompousness. "We need to talk." "Apparently so," I said, not moving from the doorway. "What can I do for you folks?" Sophie shot me a look that could have frozen hell over. "Don't be like that. You know why we're here." "Actually, I don't. Last time I checked, I wasn't welcome at family events." Something about being the poor in-law. That's when Talia stepped forward, still sniffling, still in full bridal regalia. "Marcus, please. I know what happened was wrong, but you're punishing everyone for something that wasn't my fault. This is my wedding day." I corrected gently. "This was your wedding day. And technically, you had a wedding. You got married, right? Congratulations." Jonah, poor bastard, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Getting married is stressful enough without having your reception collapse because your new in-laws decided to humiliate the guy who was secretly funding the whole thing. "Look, Marcus," he said, "I don't really understand all the family stuff that's going on here, but is there any way we can work this out? Just for tonight." I had to give him credit for trying, but he was missing the fundamental point. "Jonah, this isn't a negotiation. This isn't something that can be worked out with the right combination of apologies and promises. Your new family decided I wasn't good enough to attend your wedding. I'm respecting that decision. But the vendors," Margaret said, jumping in with that exasperated tone she used when people weren't following her perfectly logical instructions. "They're all saying they need your authorization. Surely you can just call them and turn everything back on." "I could," I agreed. "But I won't. Because the same people who thought it was funny to ban me from the wedding are now asking me to pay for it. Do you see the problem with that?" Harlan tried his diplomatic approach next. "Marcus, we understand you're upset. And we can fix this situation if you just help us get through tonight. We can sit down tomorrow and work out whatever issues you have with how things were handled." I leaned against my doorframe and really looked at them. This collection of people who'd spent the last year treating me like their personal ATM and errand boy, now standing on my porch looking like they'd been hit by a tornado. It was almost funny, in a dark, twisted way. "Harlan," I said, "I have one question for you. Just one. Who printed that sign?" The silence that followed was so complete I could hear a dog barking 3 blocks away. They all looked at each other like they were playing some kind of reverse hot potato, hoping someone else would be the one to admit what everyone already knew. Finally, Margaret cleared her throat. It was meant to be a joke that got out of hand." "A joke," I repeated. "Someone sat down at a computer, typed out those words, printed them, and attached my photograph to security instructions as a joke." "Marcus," Sophie said, "you're making this into something bigger than it was. You know my family didn't mean anything malicious by it." "Your family," I said, made a blacklist with my face on it. They handed it to security. "They told a working man to keep me out because I'm poor. How exactly am I supposed to interpret that as anything other than malicious?" Talia started crying again, which I felt bad about, but not bad enough to change my position. "You're ruining everything," she sobbed. "This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life." "Talia," I said as gently as I could, "I didn't ruin anything. I left quietly when I was told I wasn't welcome. Everything that happened after that is the consequence of decisions your family made without thinking them through." "But you could fix it," she insisted. "You could call everyone right now and turn everything back on and save the reception." "I could," I agreed. "But here's the thing. I spent the last year doing things for this family. Moving furniture, solving problems, paying deposits, handling emergencies. I did all of that because I thought I was part of the family. But today I found out that I'm not family. I'm just the guy who pays for stuff." "That's not true," Sophie said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? When was the last time anyone in this family asked how I was doing? When was the last time anyone thanked me for handling one of your emergencies? When was the last time anyone treated me like I mattered for something other than my ability to solve problems and write checks?" They didn't have an answer for that, which was answer enough. "Look," I continued, "I'm not trying to be vindictive here. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm just tired of being taken for granted, and I'm especially tired of being insulted by people who expect me to keep helping them. If you want my presence, you get me as a person. If you want my money, you treat me with respect. You can't have it both ways. So what do you want?" Harlan asked. "An apology? I want you to imagine," I said, "that none of this had anything to do with me. Imagine that you're planning a wedding and you need to pay vendors and get permits and handle logistics. Imagine that you're adults who can solve problems without calling someone you've just publicly humiliated. We stood there looking at each other for a long moment, and I could see the exact moment when they realized I wasn't going to budge. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a temporary tantrum that could be managed with the right combination of pressure and promises. This was me drawing a line and meaning it. After they left, deflated, defeated, and still dressed in their wedding finery, I turned my phone back on and immediately regretted it. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and what appeared to be several voicemails that I wasn't emotionally prepared to listen to. The digital equivalent of a 5-alarm fire, all because I decided to stop being the family's unpaid crisis management service that I was scrolling through the messages, most of which seemed to follow the same basic template of "call me back immediately," mixed with varying degrees of panic and indignation when my phone rang again. The caller ID showed Lydia Chun, Sophie's cousin who worked at some big bank in Manhattan. Lydia was one of those family members who existed on the periphery of the drama, close enough to know what was happening but smart enough to stay out of the line of fire. "Marcus," she said when I picked up, and her voice had that careful, quiet quality that people use when they're about to drop a bomb they know is going to cause massive damage. "I need to tell you something, but I need you to promise me you won't say where you heard this." "Okay," I said, settling back into my kitchen chair because something about her tone told me I was going to want to be sitting down for this conversation. "I was at the wedding," she continued, "and I heard Margaret and Harlan talking during the cocktail hour, before everything went sideways. They were standing near the bar, and I guess they thought no one was listening, but you know how sound carries in those tents." I waited, because Lydia was the kind of person who told stories in her own time, in her own way, and rushing her would just make everything take longer. "They were talking about you," she said. "About the plan for after the speeches." "The plan? Marcus, they weren't just being cruel with that sign. They were setting you up. The whole thing. The poor in-law comment, making you feel unwelcome, all of it. It was deliberate. They wanted you feeling guilty and defensive so that when they made their move later, you'd be more likely to say yes." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What move?" "They were going to ask you to co-sign a loan for Jonah. Some kind of business expansion thing. Margaret was telling Harlan that you get soft after toasts, and that if they made you feel like you had to prove yourself to the family, you'd be more likely to agree to help with financing." I sat there for a moment, letting that sink in. The poor in-law sign wasn't just cruelty for its own sake. It was psychological manipulation. They'd wanted me to feel small and grateful and desperate to prove that I belonged, so that when they eventually asked me to put my name on someone else's debt, I'd be emotionally primed to say yes. "Lydia," I said, "are you absolutely sure about this?" I heard Margaret say, and I quote, "Once he's feeling defensive about the money thing, he'll want to show us how generous he can be. We just need to make him feel like he has something to prove." The metal taste was back in my mouth, stronger this time. I'd thought the sign was just garden-variety snobbery, the kind of casual cruelty that rich people sometimes inflict on their social inferiors. But it wasn't casual at all. It was calculated. They'd sat down and planned out how to make me feel bad enough about myself that I'd agree to take on financial responsibility for someone else's business venture. "What kind of loan?" I asked. Something about Jonah wanting to expand his consulting practice. I didn't hear all the details, but Margaret was saying something about how banks want co-signers for new business loans, and how you have good credit and steady income. Of course, because apparently, in addition to being the family's unpaid wedding planner, emergency contact, and personal bank, I was also supposed to be their loan guarantor. The gift that keeps on giving, financially speaking. They had this whole strategy, Lydia continued. Make you feel excluded, then make you feel like you could earn your way back into their good graces by helping with the loan. Margaret called it managing Marcus's expectations. Managing my expectations. Like I was some kind of financial resource that needed to be carefully handled to ensure maximum yield. Not a person with feelings and dignity, just a credit score with legs. "Jesus," I said, more to myself than to Lydia. "There's more," she said, and somehow her voice got even quieter. "Harlan was worried that you might say no if they just asked straight out. So they wanted to create a situation where saying no would make you look petty and vindictive. The idea was that after they'd made you feel bad about not being included, and then graciously allowed you back in, you'd feel obligated to prove your loyalty to the family. I leaned back in my chair and stared at my ceiling, trying to process the sheer audacity of what she was describing. They hadn't just humiliated me for fun. They'd humiliated me as part of a multi-step plan to manipulate me into taking on someone else's debt. The cruelty wasn't the point. It was the strategy. Lydia, why are you telling me this? Because what they did was wrong, she said simply. And because I figured you deserved to know that this wasn't just about wedding drama. They've been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Margaret kept talking about how they needed to soften you up before making the ask. Soften me up. Like I was a piece of meat that needed to be tenderized before cooking. I appreciate you calling, I said. I really do. For what it's worth, she added, I think you did the right thing walking away. Even before I heard about the loan thing, that sign was completely out of line. Nobody deserves to be treated like that, especially not by family. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, just thinking. The whole year started making sense in a completely different way now. All those small favors and emergency situations that had trained me to be the family's go-to problem solver. All those casual comments about money and class and how different our backgrounds were. All those little moments when they'd made me feel like I had to prove I belonged at IT had all been leading up to this. The moment when they'd ask me to put my financial future on the line for someone else's business dreams and expect me to say yes because I was so grateful to be included in their world. They'd studied me like I was some kind of lab experiment, figuring out exactly how to push my buttons to get the response they wanted. The poor in-law sign wasn't an insult. It was bait. They'd wanted me to feel desperate to prove them wrong, desperate to show that I was worthy of their respect, desperate enough to sign whatever papers they put in front of me. Well, they'd certainly learned something about me today. Just not what they'd expected. That I got up and walked to my office, where I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote one sentence in the middle of the page. I am not a walking apology with a credit limit. Then I taped it to my computer monitor, where I'd see it every morning when I sat down to work. A little reminder of the day I learned the difference between being family and being a resource, and decided I was done being the latter. The really beautiful part was that their plan had actually worked, just not the way they'd intended. They had managed my expectations. They taught me to expect exactly nothing from them, which was probably the most valuable lesson anyone had ever given me. I woke up Sunday morning feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, which made sense considering I'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling and replaying Lydia's phone call in my head. There's something uniquely exhausting about discovering that people you've been trying to help have actually been running a long con on you. It's like finding out your therapist has been taking notes for a tell-all book that my phone had accumulated another dozen messages overnight, ranging from Sophie's increasingly frantic voicemails to what appeared to be a group text from various relatives offering their own versions of damage control. I deleted most of them without reading, because honestly, I was done being lectured about family loyalty by people who'd just spent a year treating me like a walking ATM. But before I could move on with my life, I needed to do one thing. Not for revenge, not to hurt anyone, but because the truth has a way of getting twisted when it passes through too many people, and I wanted my version of events on the record. That I made coffee, sat down at my computer, and opened Facebook. I'm not usually one for social media drama. Most of my posts are pictures of food or complaining about the Yankees pitching, but this felt like one of those times when staying quiet would be the same as accepting blame for something I didn't do. The post I wrote was short, simple, and completely factual. Yesterday, I arrived at my sister-in-law's wedding venue to find my photograph attached to security instructions with the words, "Do not let the poor in-law in" written underneath. I left quietly and did not attend the wedding. For those asking vendors why various services were discontinued, deposits were paid on my credit, final balances were scheduled on my authorization, and legal permits were filed under my name. I have withdrawn all authorizations effective immediately. Please direct questions about payment and service arrangements to the bride's family. That was it. No editorializing, no emotional appeals, no attempts to make anyone look bad. Just the facts, laid out in the most neutral language I could manage. Though I did attach screenshots of some of the payment confirmations and vendor emails, because nothing shuts down speculation quite like actual documentation. That I hit post and immediately felt that weird mix of relief and anxiety that comes with finally telling your side of a story. Part of me wanted to add more context, to explain about the loan scheme or the year of being taken for granted, but I figured the basic facts would speak for themselves. They did. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing with comments and private messages. Most of them were from people I barely knew, friends of friends, distant relatives, co-workers from Sophie's job, expressing shock and outrage about the sign. Apparently, the idea of literally blacklisting someone from a family wedding was offensive to people across a pretty wide spectrum of political and social views. Holy shit, Marcus, they actually put that in writing? This from my buddy Dave, who'd met Sophie's family exactly once and had spent the entire evening making jokes about their obvious wealth. What kind of people do that to family? From my cousin Rita, who lived in Ohio and barely knew Sophie, but understood basic human decency. I would have burned the whole place down. From my coworker Jennifer, who was not known for her conflict avoidance strategies. But the comment that really got to me came from Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor who'd been following my posts for years and always left the sweetest comments about my cooking experiments. Some people mistake kindness for weakness, dear. You did the right thing standing up for yourself. Around noon, I got a call from someone I didn't recognize. The caller ID said Tara Bloom, which didn't ring any bells until she introduced herself as a local blogger who covered social events and community news for some hyperlocal website I'd never heard of. Mr. Marcus, she said, I saw your Facebook post about yesterday's wedding incident, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to provide some additional context for a story I'm working on. My first instinct was to say no, because getting involved with bloggers and journalists seemed like a great way to turn a family dispute into a public circus. But then I thought about Lydia's phone call, about the deliberate manipulation and the loan scheme, and I figured maybe a little sunlight wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. What kind of context are you looking for? I asked. Well, I've been hearing from several people who were at the wedding, and there seems to be some confusion about exactly what happened and why services were discontinued. Some people are saying you left because of a misunderstanding, others are saying there was some kind of payment dispute. There was no payment dispute, I said. I paid everything I was supposed to pay. The issue was that I was told I wasn't welcome at the wedding, so I decided my money wasn't welcome either. Can you tell me more about how you were told you weren't welcome? So I did. I walked her through the whole thing. Arriving at the venue, seeing the sign, calling Sophie, driving home, withdrawing authorizations. I kept it factual, stuck to what actually happened, didn't speculate about anyone's motives or try to make anyone look worse than their actions already did. Do you have any documentation of the payments you made? She asked. I do, and I sent her redacted copies of the same receipts I'd posted on Facebook, showing months of deposits and payments for everything from catering to photography to venue fees. The story went live that afternoon on her blog, and by evening it had been picked up by a couple of other local news sites. Nothing huge. This wasn't exactly national news, but enough coverage that people started sharing it on social media with comments like, "Can you believe this?" and "What kind of family does this?" That's when Channel 7's Lena Park called. I'd seen her on the evening news for years, covering everything from local politics to human interest stories, and she had that no-nonsense reporter voice that made you feel like you were about to be either vindicated or completely destroyed. Mr. Marcus, I'm calling about the wedding incident that's been making rounds on social media. Would you be willing to make a brief statement on camera? On camera, I asked, because suddenly this felt like it was getting bigger than I'd intended. Just a short interview. People are talking about this story, and I think it would be helpful to hear directly from you about what happened and why you made the decision you did. I thought about it for about 30 seconds. On one hand, going on TV felt like escalating things beyond what was necessary. On the other hand, Sophie's family had apparently been telling people that I'd thrown some kind of tantrum over a harmless joke, and maybe it was time for a different narrative to get some airtime. Okay, I said, but I'm not interested in trashing anyone. I just want to tell my side of what happened. The interview was brief and straightforward. Lena asked me to explain the sequence of events, and I did. She asked why I'd withdrawn the payment authorizations, and I explained that if I wasn't welcome as a person, my money wasn't welcome either. She asked if I felt like my response was proportional to what had happened. Look, I said, looking directly into the camera, love without respect isn't love. It's extraction. For a year, I've been the person this family calls when they need problems solved or bills paid. But when it came time to actually include me in their celebration, They literally put my picture on a list of people who weren't allowed in. That tells you everything you need to know about how they really see me. The interview aired on the 6 o'clock news, right between a story about a local school board meeting and a feel-good piece about a dog that learned to skateboard. Nothing earth-shattering, but enough to get people talking. By bedtime, my Facebook post had been shared over 200 times, and I'd received dozens of messages from people sharing their own stories about being taken for granted by family members or in-laws. Apparently, the unpaid family ATM experience was more common than I'd realized. The weirdest part was how good it felt to have people validate that what had happened to me was actually wrong. For so long, I'd been gaslighted into thinking that my reactions were overblown, that I was being too sensitive, that I should just accept being treated poorly because that's how family works. But strangers on the internet were saying what my own family wouldn't, that no one deserves to be humiliated like that, especially not by people who are supposed to love them. It was a small victory, but sometimes small victories are enough. Monday morning brought a strange kind of calm to my life. For the first time in months, I woke up without immediately checking my phone for emergency texts from Sophie's family. No panic calls about vendor issues, no last-minute requests to handle some crisis that couldn't wait until normal business hours. Just my alarm clock, my coffee maker, and the blessed silence of a life where I wasn't anyone's unpaid emergency contact. I actually made it through my entire morning routine, shower, coffee, checking the news, before my phone started buzzing. But when it did, it wasn't the usual suspects. Instead, I had messages from people I'd forgotten were even connected to this whole mess. Sophie's college roommate, expressing shock about the story. A couple of vendors, thanking me for treating them professionally even while everything was falling apart. Even my own mother, who lived in Florida and had somehow caught wind of the situation through the mysterious network of information that connects all mothers everywhere. Marcus, her voicemail said, "I saw the news story online. That girl's family owes you an apology, and if they had any sense, they'd be grateful you handled this whole thing as gracefully as you did. Call me when you get a chance." It was nice to hear from someone who was unequivocally on my side, even if that someone was biased by the simple fact of having given birth to me. Work was weird. My coworkers had seen the story. Apparently, Jennifer had made sure everyone in the office knew about it. And I kept getting these sympathetic looks and awkward conversations where people tried to express support without directly trash-talking my wife's family. American workplace diplomacy at its finest. "That's rough, man," my supervisor Kevin said during our Monday morning check-in. "You holding up okay?" "I'm fine," I said, which was mostly true. "Just glad it's over." "Is it over?" Good question. I was hoping it was, but experience had taught me that Sophie's family wasn't great at accepting outcomes they didn't like. They were more the type to keep pushing until they either got what they wanted or exhausted everyone involved in the process. That I got my answer around 6 p.m. when I looked out my kitchen window and saw them coming up my front walk again. Same delegation as Saturday night, but somehow they looked even more deflated. Talia had traded her wedding dress for jeans and a sweater, but she was still carrying her bouquet like it was some kind of magic talisman that could fix everything. This time, I didn't make them wait on the porch. I opened the door before they could knock, partly because I wanted to get this over with and partly because I was curious about what their next strategy would be. "Marcus," Harlan said, stepping forward with the careful movements of a man who was about to ask for something he wasn't sure he'd get. "Thank you for seeing us. What can I do for you?" I asked, staying in the doorway because I wasn't ready to invite them in for a cozy chat. "We've been talking," Margaret said, "and we realized that things got out of hand this weekend. We want to make this right." "Okay," I said. "How do you plan to do that?" Talia held out her bouquet like she was making some kind of offering. The flowers were starting to wilt around the edges, which seemed appropriate for a peace treaty that was probably doomed from the start. "If you turn everything back on," Harlan said, "we'll apologize publicly. We can draft a statement together, something that acknowledges that the sign was inappropriate and that we're sorry for how everything was handled." I looked at the bouquet, which had probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month, and thought about the generator that had coughed to a stop, the band equipment being packed away, the bar lights going dark. All of that had happened on Saturday. It was Monday now. The wedding was over. The moment had passed, and they were still talking about turning things back on, like there was some kind of magical reset button I could push. Turn what back on? I asked. The wedding happened. It's over. We could have a reception, Talia said quickly. A do-over party. Just family and close friends. You could authorize the vendors again, and we could have the celebration we were supposed to have. Jonah, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke up. We could draft a statement together, he said, echoing Harlan. Something that makes it clear that we recognize what happened was wrong, and that we value you as part of the family. A statement. A do-over party. Public apologies. They were still thinking in terms of damage control and reputation management, still trying to find the right combination of words and gestures that would get them what they wanted. Let me ask you something, I said. Who printed that sign? The same silence as Saturday night. The same uncomfortable looks. The same complete inability to take responsibility for a decision that someone in their group had definitely made. It was a mistake, Margaret said finally. A stupid joke that went too far. Who printed it? Does it matter? Sophie asked, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. We're here to fix this, not to assign blame. It matters to me, I said, because someone sat down, typed those words, printed them out, and handed them to security. That wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. That was a decision, and I want to know who made it. More silence, more uncomfortable shifting, more evidence that accountability wasn't really part of their vocabulary. Look, I said, I appreciate that you drove over here again. I really do. But here's the thing. You can't unring a bell. You can't take back something like that with apologies and do-over parties. So what do you want? Harlan asked, and there was genuine frustration in his voice now. What would it take for you to forgive this and move forward? I stared at him for a long moment. This man who had spent the last year treating me like a convenient resource, who had apparently planned to manipulate me into co-signing someone else's business loan, who was now standing on my porch asking what it would cost to buy my forgiveness. I want you to imagine, I said slowly, that this had nothing to do with me. Imagine you're planning an event and you need to pay vendors and get permits and handle logistics. Imagine you're adults who can solve problems without expecting someone else to fund your mistakes. But Marcus, Talia said, your family. No, I said, and the word came out harder than I'd intended. Family doesn't put each other's pictures on blacklists. Family doesn't spend a year taking someone for granted and then act surprised when that person finally stops being available for exploitation. We never exploited you, Margaret protested. Really? What would you call asking someone to handle all your emergencies, pay your deposits, solve your problems, and then publicly humiliating them when they show up to the event they've been funding? They didn't have an answer for that either. I'm not your villain, I continued, and I'm not your savior. I'm simply done. Before they could respond, I told them about the band, the photographer, and the other vendors, how I'd paid them something for their wasted time out of my own pocket, because working people shouldn't have to suffer for other people's pride. It felt important that they knew I hadn't left innocent people hanging, even if I'd left their family to figure out their own mess.as for the rest of it. The apologies, the do-over parties, the public statements. I wished them peace and stepped back inside. The lock turned with a small, honest sound that somehow felt like the most decisive thing I'd done in years. The next few weeks were probably the weirdest of my entire adult life. You know how when you quit a job you hate, there's this strange period where you keep waking up at the wrong time and reaching for your phone to check emails that aren't your problem anymore? It was like that, except instead of a job, I'd quit being the designated family crisis manager for a group of people who'd never actually wanted me around in the first place. The internet, predictably, lost its collective mind for about 4 days and then moved on to being outraged about something else. That's the beautiful thing about social media drama. It burns hot and fast, and then everyone finds a new shiny object to focus on. But for those 4 days, I was apparently the poster child for standing up to entitled in-laws, which was surreal but not entirely unpleasant that I got interview requests from 3 different podcasts, all of which I politely declined because I wasn't trying to build a media career out of family dysfunction. A couple of wedding planning blogs wanted to use my story as a cautionary tale about managing family dynamics, which seemed like missing the point entirely. And someone from Dr. Phil's show actually called, which was both hilarious and deeply concerning. The best part was the messages I got from complete strangers sharing their own stories. Apparently, the unpaid family ATM, experience was practically universal. I heard from people who'd been funding their siblings' lifestyles, covering their parents' emergencies, or bankrolling extended family events while being treated like second-class citizens. It was like discovering you're part of some secret club you never knew existed. One message in particular stuck with me. It was from a woman named Sarah in Oregon who wrote, "I spent 10 years being my family's emergency fund while they made jokes about my job and my apartment. Your story gave me the courage to finally say no. Thank you for showing me what boundaries look like." That hit me harder than all the social media outrage combined. The idea that my spectacularly dysfunctional weekend might have helped someone else recognize their own worth was worth every uncomfortable conversation and family dinner I'd never have to attend again. Sophie, meanwhile, had moved in with her parents temporarily while we worked things out, which was fine by me, because I wasn't particularly interested in working things out with someone who thought hanging up on me was an acceptable form of conflict resolution. We met for coffee exactly once, about 2 weeks after the wedding disaster, at a neutral location that felt more like a business meeting than a marriage counseling session. "You could have fixed it," she said, stirring her latte with the kind of aggressive precision that suggested she was imagining it was my face. "You could have just called the vendors and saved everyone from this whole mess." "I did fix it," I said. "I fixed me. That's not what I meant." "I know it's not, but it's what I meant." She wanted to know if I was planning to come home, if we could get past this, if I was willing to try couples therapy. All reasonable questions from someone who was genuinely trying to save a marriage. But she never asked the question I actually wanted to hear, whether she understood why what her family had done was wrong. "They're willing to apologize," she said. "Publicly, if that's what you need. They know they screwed up." "Sophie," I said, "they put my picture on a blacklist. They called me the poor in-law and told security not to let me in. Do you understand why that's not something you apologize your way out of?" It was supposed to be funny. To who? Who exactly was supposed to find that funny? She didn't have an answer for that, which was pretty much the answer I expected. The conversation lasted about an hour and ended with both of us being very polite and very careful not to say anything that couldn't be taken back. She kept my house key but promised to give me plenty of notice before coming by to get her things. I promised to be civil if we ran into each other around town. Very mature, very adult, very much like two people who had just realized they didn't actually know each other as well as they'd thought. A week later, I wrote a letter. Not an email, not a text, but an actual physical letter that I printed out and mailed to every member of Sophie's immediate family. It was the most therapeutic thing I'd done since this whole mess started. "Dear Harlan, Margaret, Sophie, and Talia," it began. "I want to be very clear about how our relationship will work going forward. I will no longer be available for emergency loans, crisis management, or last-minute problem solving. I will not be covering deposits, co-signing anything, or providing backup funding for your plans and events. If you want my presence at family gatherings, you can extend invitations like normal people and treat me with the same basic respect you'd show any other guest. If you can't manage that, then we can be polite acquaintances who occasionally run into each other at the grocery store." I went on for about a page, laying out exactly what I would and wouldn't do going forward. No more secret bills. No more emergency credit cards. No more smiling through insults, because that's just how they are. If they wanted me in their lives, they could have me as a person with boundaries and self-respect. If they didn't want that version of me, then they were welcome to the version that stayed home and minded his own business. It felt amazing to write, even better to print, and absolutely liberating to mail. For the first time in years, I told people exactly what I expected from them instead of just hoping they'd figure out how to treat me like a human being. The responses were predictably varied. Harlan sent back a formal note acknowledging receipt of my letter and expressing hope that we could find a path forward that works for everyone. Margaret sent nothing, which was probably for the best. Talia sent a long, emotional email about how she never meant for any of this to happen and how she hoped I could forgive her family's mistakes. And Sophie sent divorce papers, which, honestly, felt like the most honest communication we'd had in months. That I signed them without drama, without lawyers, without trying to extract some kind of revenge through property division or alimony demands. We split our shared assets down the middle, kept our individual debts separate, and agreed that the house would be mine since I'd been making the mortgage payments anyway. It was all very civilized and mature, And if there was something sad about ending a marriage with the same emotional investment you'd put into canceling a gym membership, well, that probably told us everything we needed to know about what we'd actually had together. 6 months later, I was sitting in my backyard on a Saturday afternoon, reading a book and drinking a beer while my neighbor's kids played in their sprinkler next door. My phone was on silent. Nobody needed me to solve their emergencies or fund their dreams or manage their crises. It was the most peaceful afternoon I'd had in years. Sometimes a wedding ends when the cake is cut and the last dance is danced. Sometimes it ends when someone decides they're worth more than being treated like a walking apology with a credit limit. And sometimes the real celebration happens after you walk away from people who never valued your presence, only your presence. I took another sip of my beer and turned the page of my book. For the first time in a long time, home felt like a place where I was actually welcome, no sign required. At my wife's law school graduation party, my wife's brother demanded my apartment keys in front of 130 guests. When I refused, he slapped me so hard. I left and made a phone call. 30 minutes later, a man appeared at the door of the hall, and when they saw who it was, they began to cry. You know that moment when your entire world shifts sideways and you're left standing there like an idiot, wondering if what just happened actually happened? Yeah, well, welcome to my Tuesday night. I'm standing in the middle of the Royal Oaks Ballroom, surrounded by 130 people who are all pretending they didn't just witness my public humiliation, and I'm thinking about how I used to believe in things like dignity and respect. Funny how naive a guy can be at 42. Let me paint you a picture of what was supposed to be the highlight of Clara's academic career. We're talking about a graduation party that cost me more than most people's cars. Crystal chandeliers hanging overhead like expensive tears, waiters in bow ties serving champagne that probably costs more per bottle than I spend on groceries in a month, and a crowd of Clara's law school buddies and family members all dressed to impress. The whole scene screams success, achievement. Look how far we've come. I paid for every damn bit of it because that's what husbands do, right? We celebrate our wives' victories, even when those victories feel more like personal defeats. Clara's been working her ass off for 3 years to get that law degree, and I've been the supportive husband in the background, writing checks and nodding encouragingly while she complained about case studies in constitutional law. Tonight was supposed to be our victory lap, the moment where all that sacrifice paid off. I even wore my good suit, the navy one that doesn't scream. I shop at outlet malls and practiced my proud husband smile in the bathroom mirror before we left the apartment. But here's the thing about expectations. They're basically just disappointments waiting to happen. I'm nursing a glass of wine that tastes like it costs more than my monthly coffee budget when Marcus decides to make his grand entrance into my evening. Marcus Ward, Clara's older brother and professional pain in my ass, approaches me with that swagger that screams, "I'm about to ruin your night." The guy's got this way of moving through crowds like he owns the place, which is particularly irritating when I'm the one paying for the place he's swaggering through. "Adrian," he says, and already I can tell by his tone that this conversation isn't going to end with us discussing the weather. Marcus has this way of saying my name like it tastes bad in his mouth, like he's doing me a favor just by acknowledging my existence. He's holding his wine glass like a weapon, which, considering what happens next, might be more accurate than I realized at the time. "Marcus," I reply, because apparently I haven't learned that engaging with this guy is like poking a hornet's nest with a stick. But hey, it's Clara's big night, and I'm trying to be the bigger man here. Stupid me. "Listen," he continues, stepping closer until I can smell the expensive cologne he probably charged to someone else's credit card. "We need to talk about your living situation." Now, I'm confused because my living situation has exactly zero to do with Marcus Ward or anyone else in this family. I live in a decent apartment with a view that doesn't completely suck. I pay my rent on time, and I mind my own business. It's not like I'm squatting in a crack house or living in my car. But Marcus has this expression on his face like he's about to deliver some profound wisdom that's going to change my life forever. "My living situation?" I ask, because apparently I'm a glutton for punishment. "Yeah, that apartment of yours." He waves his hand dismissively, like my home is some kind of inconvenience to him personally. "You don't need all that space. It's wasteful for a guy like you." A guy like me. There it is, that casual condescension that Marcus has perfected over the years. As if my worth as a human being can be measured by square footage and whether I deserve to live somewhere decent. I'm starting to feel that familiar burn in my chest, the one that shows up whenever I have to deal with Clara's family and their complete inability to treat me like an actual person. I'm sorry, what exactly are you getting at? I ask, though I'm pretty sure I don't want to hear the answer. And then Marcus drops the bomb that turns my evening from merely awkward to absolutely surreal. Hand over the keys. Just like that. No please, no explanation, no acknowledgement that he's talking about my home, the place where I sleep, eat, and exist when I'm not pretending to enjoy family gatherings. He says it like he's asking me to pass the salt, like it's the most reasonable request in the world. Excuse me. I'm pretty sure I heard him wrong, because surely no one is stupid enough to demand someone else's apartment keys at a graduation party. You heard me. Hand them over. You don't need so much space, and frankly, it's time you learn to live within your means. The sheer audacity of it hits me like a slap, which is ironic, considering what happens next. This guy, who's never worked a steady job in his life, who borrows money from his parents like it's a hobby, is standing here telling me I need to learn to live within my means. This guy who's wearing a watch that probably costs more than my car is lecturing me about financial responsibility. Marcus, I'm not giving you my apartment keys, I say, trying to keep my voice steady because we're in public and I still have some crazy notion that adult conversations can be resolved without drama. That's when his face changes. The fake friendly mask drops, and I see something ugly underneath, something entitled and angry and completely unhinged. In hindsight, I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there. The way he'd been eyeing my place during family visits, the comments about how prime the location was, the not-so-subtle hints about how I was wasting good real estate. Listen, you little, but I never find out what colorful descriptor Marcus had planned for me because that's when his hand connects with my face. The slap echoes through the ballroom like a gunshot. My ears are ringing, my cheek is on fire, and my glasses, my good glasses, the ones that actually make me look halfway intelligent, go flying across the polished marble floor with a sound like breaking dreams. The whole thing happens in slow motion, like some kind of nightmare where you can see the disaster coming but can't do anything to stop it, and then silence. Complete, absolute, tomb-like silence. 130 people just watched Clara's brother assault her husband at her graduation party, and you could hear a pin drop. I'm standing there with my hand pressed to my burning cheek, looking around at faces that range from shocked to embarrassed to carefully neutral, and not one single person says a damn word. Not Clara's law school friends who spent 3 years listening to her complain about her difficult family. Not her professors who taught her about justice and standing up for what's right. Not her parents who raised her to be better than this. And definitely not Clara herself, who's standing 20 feet away with her mouth hanging open like she's watching a particularly interesting television show instead of her husband being publicly humiliated by her brother. The silence stretches on forever, filled with the sound of my pride cracking like those glasses scattered across the floor. I bend down slowly, carefully, gathering up the pieces of my frames while everyone watches. My hands are shaking, with shock, with humiliation, with an anger so pure it's almost beautiful. But I don't say anything. I don't scream or throw a punch or demand that someone call the police. Instead, I stand up, brush off my knees, and look around at all these people who just watch me get slapped like a disobedient child. Their faces blur together into one big mass of uncomfortable silence and averted eyes. These are supposed to be Clara's people, our people, the ones who matter in our lives. And not one of them has the backbone to say, hey, that's not okay. So I do what any self-respecting man would do in this situation. I walk out. Past the crystal chandeliers and the fancy appetizers and the champagne that costs more than most people's rent. Past Clara, who's still standing there like a statue, and her parents, who are suddenly fascinated by their shoes. Past Marcus, who's straightening his tie like he just finished some important business instead of committing assault in front of half the legal community. The ballroom lights follow me all the way to the door, bright and accusing, like they're illuminating my shame for everyone to see. My footsteps echo on the marble floor, the only sound in a room full of people who've suddenly forgotten how to speak. By the time I reach the parking garage, my hands have stopped shaking. The anger is still there, burning clean and cold in my chest, but it's focused now. Purposeful. I get in my car, the same modest sedan that Marcus loves to mock, and sit in the driver's seat for a moment, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My cheek is red and swollen, and without my glasses, I look older somehow. Different. That's when I pull out my phone and dial a number I haven't used in years. Daniel Cross answers on the second ring, probably wondering why I'm calling him at 10:30 on a Tuesday night. Daniel, I say, and my voice sounds steadier than I expected. It's time. Adrian, are you all right? You sound 30 minutes, I interrupt. Royal Oaks Hall. Bring the file. There's a pause, and then Daniel's voice gets serious. Are you sure? I look back at the ballroom entrance, where people are probably still standing around pretending they didn't just witness the most humiliating moment of my life, where my wife is probably making excuses for her brother's behavior and wondering why her husband couldn't just be reasonable about the whole thing. I'm sure, I tell him. It's time they learned who they're really dealing with. And for the first time in years, I actually mean it. You want to know the funny thing about being underestimated? It's actually a superpower, except nobody realizes they have it until it's too late to matter. My name is Adrian Holt. I'm 42 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I've been playing the role of the unremarkable husband so convincingly that even I sometimes forget it's an act. But tonight, sitting in this parking garage with my cheek still burning from Marcus's slap, I'm remembering exactly why I chose to be invisible in the first place. Let me give you the Adrian Holt that everyone thinks they know. I drive a 2018 Honda Accord with a small dent in the rear bumper that I never bothered fixing because, honestly, who gives a damn? It gets me from point A to point B without making any grand statements about my masculinity or success level. The interior smells faintly of the vanilla air freshener that Clara bought me for Christmas 3 years ago, and there's a coffee stain on the passenger seat that tells the story of a particularly rough Monday morning in 2022. It's the kind of car that blends into traffic, the automotive equivalent of beige wallpaper.my wardrobe. Let's just say I'm not exactly setting any fashion trends. I shop at department stores during end-of-season sales, buying solid-colored shirts and khakis that won't offend anyone or draw attention. My shoes are comfortable rather than stylish. My watch is a basic Timex that I've had since college, and my winter coat came from Costco. Clara used to joke that I dressed like an accountant from 1987, and honestly, she wasn't wrong. The joke's on her, though, because that's exactly the look I was going for work-wise. I tell people I do consulting, which is vague enough to be true while being specific enough to sound legitimate. I work part-time, mostly from home, helping small businesses with their organizational systems and efficiency protocols. It's boring as hell, pays modestly, and gives me plenty of time to read mystery novels and watch way too much Netflix. At least, that's what I let people believe. The reality is that I could retire tomorrow and live comfortably for the rest of my life. But where's the fun in that? My apartment, the same one Marcus just demanded the keys to, is furnished with pieces I picked up from estate sales and secondhand stores. The couch is comfortable but not impressive. The dining table seats 4, but wouldn't look out of place in a college dorm, and my television is a perfectly adequate 40-inch model that Clara constantly complains isn't big enough for proper movie watching. I keep the thermostat at 68 degrees in winter and 75 in summer because I'm allegedly frugal, and I buy generic brands at the grocery store like some kind of coupon-clipping suburban dad. This is the Adrian Holt that Clara fell in love with, or at least the one she thought she could manage. See, Clara likes being the star of the show, the successful one, the partner with ambition and drive and a future worth bragging about. When we met 5 years ago at some forgettable networking event, I was the perfect supporting character for her main character energy. I was stable, supportive, and most importantly, I didn't threaten to overshadow her accomplishments. She'd introduce me to her friends as my husband Adrian. He does consulting work, with this slightly apologetic tone that suggested she'd settled for less than she deserved, but was making the best of it. Her law school classmates would give me those polite smiles that said, "Oh, how nice for you," before immediately turning the conversation back to Clara's latest academic achievement or internship opportunity. I played along, asking interested questions about tort law and constitutional interpretation, while internally wondering if any of these people had ever had an original thought in their lives. Clara's family, particularly Marcus, took my modest lifestyle as confirmation of their worst assumptions about me. Marcus would show up at family dinners and immediately start commenting on my outdated suits, my embarrassing car, my general failure to live up to whatever standard he'd set for men worthy of his sister's attention. He'd make jokes about how I was lucky Clara loved me despite my obvious limitations, how she could do better if she really wanted to, how my lack of ambition was probably holding her back from reaching her full potential. Clara would laugh. Not uncomfortable, stop it Marcus laughter, but genuine amusement, like his observations were particularly clever insights into my character. She'd pat my arm sympathetically and say things like, Adrian's not ambitious in the traditional sense, but he's very supportive, as if supporting her dreams was the consolation prize for being too mediocre to have any dreams of my own. Her parents weren't much better. Clara's mother would make pointed comments about how some men peak early and how stability is important too, dear, while her father would give me career advice about maximizing my potential and thinking bigger picture. They weren't trying to be cruel. They genuinely believed they were helping me improve myself to become more worthy of their daughter. The condescension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and I smiled through all of it. Nodded along when Marcus suggested I needed a real job with real responsibilities. Thanked Clara's father for his LinkedIn connection recommendations. Listened patiently when her mother explained how I could dress for the job I wanted, not the job I had. I played the part of the grateful underachiever who was lucky enough to marry above his station and smart enough not to rock the boat. But here's what none of them knew. What none of them bothered to discover because they were too busy congratulating themselves on their superior judgment. I learned the art of deliberate mediocrity from a master, my father, Richard Holt, built a real estate empire from nothing. Started with a single rental property in 1978 and spent 30 years quietly, methodically, almost invisibly expanding his portfolio until he owned half the commercial district and a significant chunk of the residential market in our city. He never advertised his success, never drove flashy cars, never lived in a mansion or joined exclusive country clubs. He wore the same brand of khakis for 20 years, ate lunch at the same diner every Tuesday, and let people assume he was just another small-time landlord trying to make ends meet. The moment people know how much you're worth, he told me when I was 18, is the moment they start seeing dollar signs instead of your face. Better to be underestimated than overexposed. He died when I was 35, leaving me with a portfolio that would make most trust fund babies weep with envy. Commercial buildings, apartment complexes, investment accounts, bonds, stocks, enough assets to fund a small country's annual budget. But along with the money came his most valuable lesson. Power is only useful when people don't see it coming. So I became Adrian the underachiever, Adrian the modest consultant, Adrian the guy who shops at Target and thinks Olive Garden is fancy dining. I let Clara's family believe I was the charity case their daughter had generously taken on as a personal improvement project. I let Marcus mock my car and my clothes and my apparent lack of ambition while he racked up credit card debt and borrowed money from his parents to maintain his lifestyle. The beautiful irony? While Marcus was sneering at my secondhand furniture, I was paying Clara's law school tuition. While her parents were giving me career advice, I was covering her rent and groceries. While Clara was apologizing to her friends for my lack of professional success, I was quietly ensuring she never had to worry about student loans or living expenses or any of the financial stress that usually comes with pursuing a graduate degree. They thought their comfortable lifestyle was luck, good planning, Clara's smart budgeting. They had no idea it was me, writing checks and making transfers and ensuring that the Ward family could maintain their illusion of financial stability while looking down on the guy who was actually funding their lives. Clara never asked too many questions about how we managed to afford our lifestyle on my supposedly modest consulting income. She was too busy with school, too focused on her own goals, too comfortable with the arrangement to examine it too closely. When I suggested we could afford a nicer apartment, she assumed I'd gotten a raise. When I bought her a decent car to replace her college beater, she thought I'd saved up. When her family needed help with various expenses over the years, Marcus's gambling debts, her parents' home repairs, her mother's medical bills, I was the anonymous benefactor they never suspected. For 3 years, I've been the invisible ATM funding their contempt for me. The pathetic husband whose money they gladly spend while mocking his failure to achieve anything worthwhile. The disappointing son-in-law whose financial support they accept while treating him like an embarrassment to the family name. But tonight, sitting in my boring Honda with my swollen cheek and broken glasses, I'm done being underestimated. Tonight, Daniel Cross is driving over with a file that contains the truth about who I really am and what I'm really worth. Tonight, the Ward family is about to learn that the man they've been treating like their personal joke has been their meal ticket all along. And honestly, I can't wait to see the looks on their faces when they realize the mouse they've been kicking around has been a lion all along, just waiting for the right moment to roar. You know how they say hindsight is 20/20? Well, looking back now, I realize I've been living in a house of cards for months, and I was too busy playing the supportive husband to notice that Marcus had been planning my demolition all along. The signs were there. Hell, they were practically neon billboards. But I was so committed to my role as Adrian the Agreeable that I ignored every single red flag until they formed a parade right through my living room. The first time Marcus visited my apartment, about 8 months ago, I should have known something was off. Clara had been talking about having her family over for dinner. You know, one of those, let's all pretend we're a happy, functional family events that always end with someone saying something passive-aggressive about the mashed potatoes. I spent the better part of a Saturday cleaning, grocery shopping, and pretending I knew how to cook something more sophisticated than grilled cheese and tomato soup. Marcus showed up wearing this expression like he was doing me a personal favor just by gracing my humble abode with his presence. He walked through my front door like he was conducting some kind of real estate inspection, running his fingers along surfaces and making these little humming noises that somehow managed to sound judgmental. Clara was in the kitchen, loudly explaining to her mother why my silverware didn't match, while I tried to make conversation with her father about the weather. But Marcus went straight to my balcony. Now, I'll admit, the view from my apartment is pretty decent. 14th floor, overlooking the city center, you can see the river on clear days, and the skyline lights up nice at night. It's not penthouse-level spectacular, but it's definitely above average for what most people can afford in this neighborhood. I've always appreciated it. There's something calming about being able to look out over the city and remember that your problems are just tiny specks in a much bigger picture. Marcus stood out there for a good 10 minutes, hands in his pockets, staring out like he was calculating something in his head. When he finally came back inside, he had this weird smile on his face, the kind that doesn't quite reach your eyes and makes you wonder what joke you're not in on. Prime location, he said, not to me, but to Clara, like I wasn't standing right there. Really prime. Someone sitting on a gold mine here. At the time, I thought he was maybe giving me a compliment, acknowledging that I'd managed to find a decent place despite my supposedly limited means. I actually felt a little proud, like maybe I'd finally done something that impressed Clara's family. Looking back, I realized he wasn't complimenting me. He was appraising my home like it was already his. The dinner itself was the usual Ward family circus. Clara's mother spent most of the meal explaining how I could improve my seasoning techniques. Her father gave me a 20-minute lecture about investment strategies that I could have taught him, and Marcus regaled us all with stories about his latest get-rich-quick scheme involving cryptocurrency and some business partner who was definitely going to make them all millionaires by Christmas. But it was after dinner, when Clara was in the bathroom and her parents were arguing about directions home, that Marcus showed his true colors. I was clearing plates in the kitchen when I heard him on his phone in the living room, his voice low, but not quite low enough. No, listen to me, he was saying. If I can push Adrian out, Clara and I can take over the place for a while. Split the rent, maybe even get him to cover the deposit on something smaller for himself. I stopped moving, standing there with a handful of dirty plates like some kind of eavesdropping statue. Push me out. Take over my apartment? Split rent on the place I was paying for entirely by myself? The sheer audacity of it hit me like a physical force. He's not going to fight it, Marcus continued, clearly enjoying his own cleverness. Guy's a pushover. Clara's got him wrapped around her finger, and he's too weak to stand up for himself. Trust me, this is going to be easier than taking candy from a baby. I wanted to march into that living room and confront him right then and there. I wanted to grab him by his overpriced shirt and explain exactly who he was dealing with and what he could do with his little takeover plan. But Clara chose that moment to come out of the bathroom. Her parents started making their goodbye noises, and Marcus smoothly ended his call like nothing had happened. Instead, I bit my tongue and helped everyone find their coats. That night, after they left, I tried to talk to Clara about what I'd overheard. I kept it casual, you know, just mentioned that Marcus seemed really interested in our living situation and maybe we should be careful about family boundaries. Clara laughed it off like I was being paranoid. Marcus is just being Marcus, she said, already focused on her laptop and some case study she was working on. He likes nice things, and he's probably a little jealous that we have such a great place. Don't read too much into it. Jealous, right? Because wanting to steal someone's home is just a normal expression of envy that we should all understand and forgive. But I let it go because that's what I did back then. I let things go in the interest of keeping the peace. I filed Marcus's conversation away in my mental catalog of Ward family red flags and went about my business of being the supportive, undemanding husband who didn't make waves. The comments started getting more pointed after that. Every family gathering, every phone call, every casual visit became an opportunity for Marcus to make some observation about how I was wasting good real estate. He'd walk around my apartment like he was already living there, suggesting how the furniture could be rearranged, how the space could be better utilized, how someone with vision could really make the place shine. You know, Adrian, he said during Clara's birthday dinner in March, a guy like you doesn't really need all this space. It's kind of selfish when you think about it. There are families out there who could really use a place like this. Clara giggled like he'd said something charmingly philosophical instead of basically calling me a selfish space hoarder. Her parents nodded along like Marcus was making perfect sense, like my living situation was somehow a moral failing that needed to be corrected. Maybe you should think about downsizing, Clara's mother added helpfully. Something cozier, more appropriate for your lifestyle. More appropriate for my lifestyle. Translation: something more suitable for someone of my obviously limited means and social status. Something that wouldn't make them feel bad about their own living situations or remind them that the family disappointment somehow had a nicer place than they did. The suggestions became more frequent and more pointed. Marcus started sending me real estate listings for studio apartments and one-bedrooms in less desirable neighborhoods, always with helpful notes like, "This looks more your speed," or "perfect for someone starting out." Starting out? I'm 42 years old, not 22, but apparently in Marcus's mind, I was perpetually a beginner who needed to learn his place. Clara started parroting his opinions, because God forbid she develop an independent thought about our living situation. Suddenly, she was concerned about our financial responsibility and whether we were being realistic about our housing costs. She started making comments about how smaller spaces are more intimate and how we didn't really need all those extra rooms anyway. The final straw came about a month before the graduation party. I was working in my home office, the spare bedroom that I'd converted into a workspace where I could manage my actual business affairs without Clara nosing around. When I heard voices in the hallway outside my apartment, I looked through the peephole and saw Marcus with some guy I didn't recognize, both of them gesturing at my door like they were discussing something important. That I opened the door and found Marcus mid-sentence. Perfect for what we need, and the location can't be beat. "Marcus," I said, stepping into the hallway. "What's going on?" He jumped like I'd caught him stealing something, which, in retrospect, wasn't far from the truth. The other guy, tall, expensive suit, the kind of slick-back hair that screams, "I sell things people don't need," looked between us with obvious confusion. "Oh, Adrian. Hey, buddy," Marcus said, turning on that fake friendly smile that I'd learned to recognize as a warning sign. "This is Derek. He's a friend of mine. I was just showing him around the building." Showing him around the building. Right. Because that's totally normal behavior for someone who doesn't live in the building and has no business conducting tours. "Derek's in real estate," Marcus continued, like this explained everything. I thought he might have some insights about property values in the area. Derek extended his hand with a practiced smile. "Nice to meet you. Marcus was telling me about the unit layouts in this building. Really impressive space you've got here." The way he said it made my skin crawl. Like he was already calculating square footage and market comparisons, like my home was just another property to be evaluated and potentially flipped. That night, I confronted Clara directly. No beating around the bush, no diplomatic language, just straight talk about her brother's obvious intentions and her apparent willingness to go along with them. "Clara," I said, We need to talk about Marcus and this obsession he has with our apartment. She was sitting on the couch, still in her law school clothes, looking tired and annoyed that I was interrupting her study time with domestic drama. What about it? She asked, not even looking up from her textbook. He's planning something. The phone calls, the comments, bringing real estate agents to look at our building. This isn't normal behavior. That got her attention. She looked up with this expression of exaggerated patience, like I was a child who needed to have simple concepts explained to him. Adrian, you're being paranoid. Marcus is just interested in real estate. It's not a crime. And Derek isn't an agent. He's just a friend who works in the industry. A friend who was evaluating our apartment like he was planning to buy it. Clara sighed and closed her book with more force than necessary. Listen, even if Marcus was interested in the apartment, would that be such a terrible thing? He's family. And honestly, you have to admit, this place is pretty big for just the two of us. Maybe it would make sense to consider something smaller, something more practical. There it was. The truth I'd been avoiding for months. Clara wasn't just tolerating Marcus's schemes, she was actively supporting them. She wanted me out of my own home just as much as he did. This is my home, Clara, I said quietly. Our home. I'm not giving it up because your brother thinks he deserves it more than I do. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something cold flicker across her face, something calculating that I'd never noticed before. Well, she said finally, I guess we'll see about that. And that's when I knew. 3 weeks before Marcus slapped me in front of 130 people, I finally understood that my marriage wasn't a partnership. It was a hostile takeover that had been in progress for months. I was just too stupid, too trusting, too committed to being the good guy to see it coming. But I was starting to see it now. 2 weeks before Marcus decided to redecorate my face at Clara's graduation party, the Ward family pulled what I can only describe as a full-scale intervention. Except instead of trying to help me overcome some destructive addiction, they were trying to convince me that wanting to live in my own apartment was somehow a character flaw that needed immediate correction. Picture this, a Tuesday evening. I'm sitting in my living room reading a perfectly decent thriller novel about a guy who discovers his wife is plotting to kill him. Ironic in hindsight, when Clara announces that her family is coming over for an important discussion. Now, any reasonable person would hear important family discussion and immediately start preparing for bad news. Someone's sick, someone's getting divorced, someone's been arrested for tax evasion. You know, actual important stuff that families need to discuss. But Clara presented it like we were all getting together to plan a surprise birthday party. So I figured maybe her parents wanted to talk about anniversary plans or Marcus had finally gotten a real job. Shows what I know about reading the room. They arrived en masse at 7:30, like some kind of well-dressed SWAT team prepared for a delicate operation. Clara's mother, Patricia, came armed with a casserole that nobody asked for and that passive-aggressive smile she reserves for situations where she's about to say something horrible while pretending it's for your own good. Her father, Robert, brought his laptop and a folder full of papers, which should have been my first clue that this wasn't a social visit. And Marcus? Marcus strutted in like he was about to inherit the place, which, considering what happened next, wasn't far from the truth. Adrian, dear, Patricia said, settling herself on my couch like she was claiming territory. We're so glad you could make time for us tonight. Make time for them? In my own home? On a Tuesday evening when I wasn't doing anything more pressing than trying to figure out who the murderer was in Chapter 12? But I played along because that's what I did back then. I played along with whatever bizarre family theater the Wards wanted to perform. Of course, I said, because apparently I'm a masochist. Can I get anyone coffee? Wine? A strong sedative? Nobody laughed at my joke, which should have been warning sign number 2. The Ward family loves to laugh at things that aren't funny. Usually my clothes, my car, or my general existence. But they couldn't even manage a polite chuckle at actual humor. Clara was sitting in the armchair across from me, looking nervous but determined, like she was about to deliver some prepared speech that she'd been practicing in the bathroom mirror. Robert opened his laptop and spread his papers across my coffee table with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly planned this moment down to the last detail. Adrian, we wanted to talk to you about your future. Your living situation, specifically. My future. My living situation. As if these were things that any of them had any business discussing, much less deciding. I glanced at Clara, hoping for some clue about what fresh hell was about to unfold, but she was suddenly fascinated by her manicure. My living situation seems to be working out fine, I said carefully, because even though alarm bells were going off in my head, I still believed we could handle this like rational adults. Well, that's just it, Patricia said, leaning forward with that concerned expression she uses when she's about to say something particularly insulting. We're not sure it is working out, dear. For someone in your position. My position. Like I was some kind of charity case they'd all agreed to help out of the goodness of their hearts. I looked around at these people sitting in my living room, eating food I'd paid for, judging a lifestyle I'd funded, and felt that familiar burn of anger starting in my chest. What exactly is my position? I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to hear the answer. Marcus decided this was his moment to shine. He stood up and started pacing around my living room like he was delivering a closing argument in some imaginary courtroom where my housing choices were on trial. Look, Adrian, he began, using that patronizing tone people use when they're about to explain why your perfectly reasonable life decisions are actually terrible mistakes. We all care about you. That's why we're here. But living in a place like this, when you're not exactly setting the world on fire career-wise, it's just not sustainable. Not setting the world on fire career-wise. This from a guy who'd been between opportunities for the better part of 2 years and whose idea of a business plan involved buying lottery tickets and hoping for the best. The rent alone must be eating up most of your income, Robert added, consulting his papers like he was reading from some financial report about my allegedly dire situation. And that's not even considering utilities, maintenance, insurance, the hidden costs of living beyond your means. Beyond my means. They were sitting in my apartment, which I owned outright thanks to my father's real estate empire, talking about how I couldn't afford to live there. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife, but they were all nodding along like Robert had just delivered some profound economic wisdom. We've done some research, Patricia continued, pulling out real estate listings like she was presenting evidence in court. There are some lovely smaller places available. More appropriate for someone just starting out. At 42. After being married to their daughter for 3 years. After paying for Clara's education and covering family expenses they didn't even know about. But sure, I was just starting out, a beginner who needed their guidance to make basic life decisions. Clara finally decided to contribute to the conversation. Adrian, they're just trying to help. Maybe we should consider whether this place is really practical for us. Practical, right? Because nothing says impractical like living in a comfortable apartment that you can easily afford and actually enjoy. But Clara had clearly been recruited to their cause, adding her voice to the chorus of people who thought my life needed their management. Think about it this way, Marcus said, warming to his theme like a used car salesman who smells a commission. You could move somewhere smaller, more affordable, and use the money you save to invest in your future. Maybe take some courses, learn new skills, really focus on advancing your career. Advancing my career. The career that was secretly funding their entire lifestyle while they sat around discussing how unsuccessful I was. The career that had generated enough passive income to pay Clara's tuition, cover Marcus's gambling debts, and handle Robert's medical bills without breaking a sweat. But sure, I needed to focus on advancement. And honestly, Marcus continued, really hitting his stride now. Keeping all this space when you don't really need it? It's kind of selfish. There are families out there who could really use a place like this. People with kids, people who are actually contributing something meaningful to society. People who are actually contributing something meaningful to society. From the guy who'd never held a steady job, never paid his own rent without help, never contributed anything more meaningful than sarcastic commentary about other people's life choices. The balls on this guy were absolutely astronomical. Robert leaned forward with his most serious expression. Son, we're not trying to pressure you. We're just concerned that you might be making decisions based on pride rather than practicality. Son, this man who'd never shown the slightest interest in my well-being until it became inconvenient was calling me son and talking about pride versus practicality. The man whose mortgage I'd been secretly helping with for 2 years was lecturing me about financial responsibility. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked, though I was starting to get a pretty clear picture of where this conversation was heading. Patricia brightened up like I'd finally asked the right question. Well, We found some wonderful options in your price range. Studio apartments, one-bedrooms, all very cozy and much more suitable for a young couple starting their lives together. She started spreading out listings like she was dealing cards in some real estate poker game. Tiny spaces in questionable neighborhoods, places with names like Sunset Manor and Garden View Apartments that probably hadn't seen a sunset or a garden since the Carter administration. This one has a lovely kitchenette, she said, pointing to a picture of what looked like a closet with a hot plate. And look at this charming Murphy bed. A Murphy bed. They wanted me to move from my comfortable two-bedroom apartment to a place where my bed folded into the wall. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. Marcus had moved over to my balcony door and was looking out at the view like he was already planning how to redecorate. Of course, if you decided to make a change, you wouldn't have to worry about finding someone to take over the lease. I'd be happy to help you out there. Happy to help me out. Right. Because Marcus was known for his generous spirit and willingness to sacrifice for others. I'm sure his offer had nothing to do with the fact that he'd been eyeing my apartment like a starving man looking at a steak dinner. That's very thoughtful, I said, my voice probably a little sharper than I intended. But I'm not interested in moving. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Patricia's smile got tighter. Robert started shuffling his papers with unnecessary force, and Clara looked like I'd just announced my intention to join a cult. Adrian, Clara said carefully, maybe you should just think about it. Sleep on it. We're not asking for an immediate decision. But Marcus wasn't interested in giving me time to think. He turned away from the balcony with that cold expression I'd seen glimpses of before, but never directed at me so directly. Listen, Adrian, he said, his voice losing all pretense of friendliness. Let's cut the bullshit here. You're not fooling anyone with this whole successful man about town act. We all know what you are, a middle-aged guy with a mediocre job and delusions of grandeur. You'll hand over this apartment sooner or later, because that's what guys like you do. You fold when the pressure gets too high. Guys like me. There it was, the contempt he'd been hiding behind fake concern and family loyalty. The real Marcus, the one who saw me as an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be respected. And what if I don't? I asked quietly. Marcus smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. Then we'll have to explore other options, won't we? Other options. Like public humiliation at graduation parties. Like assault in front of crowds. Like turning my wife against me and making my life so miserable that I'd eventually give in just to make it stop. That was the moment I realized that this wasn't really about the apartment at all. This was about power, about putting me in my place, about making sure I understood exactly where I stood in the Ward family hierarchy. They weren't trying to help me make better life choices. They were trying to break me down until I accepted their version of who I was supposed to be. That I looked around at these four people sitting in my living room, planning my future without my consent, and made a decision that would have surprised them if they'd been smart enough to recognize it. I think this conversation is over, I said, standing up. Thanks for your concern, but I'm happy with my current living situation. The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken threats and barely contained anger. Patricia gathered up her real estate listings with wounded dignity. Robert closed his laptop with unnecessary force, and Marcus stared at me like he was memorizing my face for future reference. Clara walked them to the door with apologetic murmurs about how I needed time to process their suggestions, how I'd come around eventually, how they shouldn't take my stubbornness personally. After they left, she turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, disappointment mixed with something that looked suspiciously like contempt. You could have at least pretended to consider their advice, she said. Their advice. I repeated. Clara, they weren't giving advice. They were staging a coup. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the exact moment when she made her choice between her husband and her family. Maybe, she said finally, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. And that's when I knew that the battle lines had been drawn, and I was standing on one side while my wife had already chosen the other. So here I am, sitting in my boring Honda Accord in the parking garage of the Royal Oaks Hall, my cheeks still throbbing from Marcus's greatest hit, and I'm finally making the phone call I should have made about 3 years ago. You know that moment when you realize you've been playing chess while everyone else has been playing checkers, except you're the only one who didn't know the rules had changed? Yeah, welcome to my Tuesday night revelation. Brought to you by public humiliation and a broken pair of glasses. Daniel Cross answers on the second ring. Probably because lawyers never really sleep. They just enter a state of billing hour hibernation where they can still respond to client emergencies. I've known Daniel for 15 years, ever since he helped me navigate the legal maze of inheriting my father's empire. And he's the only person alive who knows the full scope of what I'm actually worth. Not Clara, not her family, not even my accountant has the complete picture. Just Daniel. Because sometimes you need one person who knows all your secrets so you don't accidentally forget who you really are. Adrian. His voice has that carefully neutral tone that lawyer's perfect. The one that says they're ready for anything from a DUI arrest to a hostile takeover. It's late. Everything all right. I catch my reflection in the rearview mirror and almost laugh at the irony. My cheek is red and swollen. My hair is messed up from running my hands through it. And I look like a guy who just got his ass handed to him by his brother-in-law at his wife's graduation party. Which, to be fair, is exactly what just happened. Daniel, I say, and my voice sounds steadier than I expected. Remember that conversation we had 3 years ago? About contingency plans and exit strategies? There's a pause, and I can practically hear the wheels turning in his legal brain. Daniel's been handling my father's affairs since before I was old enough to understand what a portfolio meant, and he's the one who helped me set up the elaborate financial shell game that's been funding Clara's family while they mock my supposed poverty. The nuclear option? He asks carefully. The nuclear option? I confirm. It's time. Another pause, longer this time. Daniel knows exactly what this means. He's the one who helped me structure everything so that it could all be undone with a single phone call. All those anonymous payments. All those convenient coincidences that kept the Ward family financially comfortable while they treated me like their personal disappointment. They're about to discover that their meal ticket just got canceled. Adrian, are you sure about this? Once we start this process, there's no going back. Your relationship with Clara? My relationship with Clara just ended about 10 minutes ago when her brother slapped me in front of 130 people and she stood there like it was performance art. I interrupt. Bring the file, Daniel. All of it. The real portfolio, the payment records, the transfers, everything. I can hear him moving around, probably reaching for the safe where he keeps the documents that could reshape the Ward family's entire understanding of reality. See, the beautiful thing about being systematically underestimated is that nobody bothers to ask the right questions. For 3 years, I've been the mysterious benefactor behind Clara's comfortable lifestyle, and she never once wondered how a part-time consultant could afford to cover law school tuition, rent, groceries, and the occasional family emergency. The graduation party payments too, Daniel asks, and I can hear papers rustling in the background. Especially those, I say, feeling something that might be satisfaction warming in my chest. I want Marcus to know exactly who paid for the champagne he was drinking when he decided to redecorate my face. Because here's the thing that's going to make this whole evening even more delicious. The graduation party that just witnessed my public humiliation, the one where Marcus felt comfortable enough to assault me in front of Clara's entire professional network, I paid for every damn bit of it. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the open bar, the photographer, all of it funded by Adrian the underachiever, courtesy of a checking account that Marcus doesn't even know exists. How long do you need? I ask, checking my watch. It's almost 11, and I'm guessing the party is still going strong. Nothing like a little family drama to get people talking and drinking. 30 minutes, Daniel says. I'll need to print everything, organize it chronologically. Are you planning to present this tonight? Oh, I'm definitely presenting this tonight, I say, and I realize I'm actually smiling for the first time in hours. Marcus wants to know what kind of man I really am. Well, Christmas came early this year. While Daniel pulls together the documentation that's going to turn the Ward family's world upside down, I sit in my car and think about the beautiful irony of the situation. For 3 years, I've been writing checks and making transfers to ensure that Clara could focus on her studies without worrying about money. Law school isn't cheap, and neither is maintaining the lifestyle that allows someone to attend law school without working. But Clara never had to worry about any of that because her supposedly unsuccessful husband was quietly covering everything. The apartment that Marcus is so desperate to get his hands on, I own it outright, bought it cash 3 years ago as a wedding gift to myself. The monthly rent that Clara thinks we're paying? That's actually going into an investment account in her name that she doesn't know about. I was planning to surprise her with it when she graduated, a little nest egg to help her start her legal career without student loan debt weighing her down, that Marcus's gambling debts that mysteriously got paid off last year. That was me, funneling money through a third-party payment company so the family would never know where the help was coming from. Clara's parents' medical bills when Robert had his heart surgery? Also me, working through Daniel to make anonymous payments that kept them from losing their house. Every family dinner where Marcus mocked my cheap clothes and modest lifestyle. He was wearing shoes I helped pay for. Every time Clara's mother made passive-aggressive comments about my lack of ambition, she was sitting in a house that I'd helped save from foreclosure. Every occasion when Clara apologized to her friends for my apparent lack of success, she was driving a car that I'd bought her with money from a portfolio they didn't even know existed. The Ward family has been living off my generosity while treating me like their charity case, and they've been so blinded by their own sense of superiority that they never bothered to question how their comfortable lifestyle was actually possible. Clara makes decent money as a law clerk, but not law school tuition plus living expenses money. Marcus hasn't held a steady job since the Obama administration. Her parents are retired on a fixed income that barely covers their basic needs. But somehow, magically, everyone's bills get paid, everyone's emergencies get handled, everyone gets to maintain their middle-class lifestyle without ever having to make the hard choices that usually come with limited income. They just assumed they were lucky or smart or entitled to their comfort by virtue of being such wonderful people who deserved good things. An MY phone buzzes with a text from Daniel. Almost ready. Are you sure you want to do this in public? I type back. They humiliated me in public. Turnabout is fair play. Because that's the thing about the Ward family. They love an audience when they think they're winning. Marcus wouldn't have slapped me in private. He needed witnesses to see him put me in my place. Clara wouldn't have stood there doing nothing if we were alone. She needed her professional network to see that she wasn't going to defend her unsuccessful husband against her successful brother's righteous anger. They wanted a show, so I'm going to give them a show. Except this time, I'm going to be the one with the dramatic reveal, and they're going to be the ones standing there with their mouths hanging open. Another text from Daniel. Building security might ask questions if I show up with a briefcase at this hour. I look back at the entrance to the Royal Oaks Hall, where people are still streaming in and out, probably heading to their cars to call their friends and share the gossip about the guy who got slapped at the graduation party. Soon they're going to have a whole lot more to talk about. Tell them you're my lawyer, and this is an emergency. I text back, which is technically true. My phone rings immediately. Adrian, I have to ask, are you doing this because you're angry, or because it's the right thing to do? I think about that for a moment, watching people leave the party in groups, their laughter carrying across the parking garage. Some of them probably feel bad for me. Some of them probably think I deserved it. Most of them probably haven't given it a second thought because other people's drama makes for good entertainment but doesn't really matter in the long run. Both, I say finally. I'm absolutely furious, and I'm also absolutely right. They've been treating me like garbage while living off my money, and it's time they learn the truth about who's been funding their contempt. Fair enough, Daniel says. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Are you going to be okay until then? I look at myself in the rearview mirror again. The swelling in my cheek is going down, and my hair is starting to look less like I stuck my finger in an electrical socket. In 20 minutes, I'm going to walk back into that ballroom and deliver the most expensive education the Ward family has ever received. Daniel, I say, I've never been better. And for the first time in 3 years, I actually mean it. Daniel Cross arrives looking like the legal equivalent of a special forces operator, black suit, silver briefcase, and that expression lawyers get when they're about to ruin someone's entire evening. He slides into the passenger seat of my Honda like we're planning a bank heist instead of delivering the most expensive reality check in Ward family history. You sure about this? He asks one more time. Because lawyers are professionally obligated to make sure their clients aren't about to do something spectacularly stupid. That I look back at the ballroom entrance where people are still trickling out, probably dissecting the evening's entertainment over valet-parked cars and Uber rides. Daniel, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Walking back into that ballroom feels like returning to the scene of a crime, except this time I'm the one carrying the smoking gun. The party's still going strong. Clara's law school friends clustered around cocktail tables, her professors making awkward small talk with her family, Marcus holding court near the bar like he's some kind of conquering hero instead of a grown man who just committed assault in front of half the legal community. The moment we step through the doors, conversations start dying like dominoes falling in slow motion. Heads turn, whispers begin, and suddenly everyone's pretending not to stare at the guy who got slapped and inexplicably came back for more. Clara spots us first, her face going pale as she recognizes Daniel from our wedding. She knows exactly who he is and what he represents, which makes her expression of dawning horror absolutely priceless. Marcus, on the other hand, is still riding high on his moment of triumph. He sees me walking toward him with a lawyer in tow and actually grins, like this is proof that I'm exactly the pathetic loser he always said I was. Well, he announces loud enough for half the room to hear. Looks like Adrian brought backup. What's next? A strongly worded letter from Mommy. The crowd around him laughs, because nothing's funnier than watching someone get humiliated twice in one evening. Clara starts moving toward us, probably planning some kind of damage control, but Daniel's already in motion. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel says in that courtroom voice that cuts through conversation like a hot knife through butter, if I could have your attention for just a moment. The ballroom goes quiet except for the soft jazz that's still playing from the sound system, creating this surreal soundtrack for what's about to become the most expensive 15 minutes of the Ward family's lives. My name is Daniel Cross, and I'm here representing my client, Mr. Adrian Holt, in some urgent financial matters concerning Mr. Marcus Ward and Mrs. Clara Holt. You could hear a pin drop. Marcus's grin falters slightly, probably because having a lawyer announce urgent financial matters at a party is never good news. Clara looks like she's going to be sick, and her parents have suddenly developed a keen interest in examining their shoes. Daniel opens his briefcase with the kind of theatrical precision that costs $800 an hour. First, I have here formal notification of the immediate cancellation of all educational support currently being provided to Mrs. Clara Holt. He hands Clara an envelope like he's serving a subpoena. Her hands are shaking as she opens it, and I watch her face go from confusion to understanding to absolute panic as she reads the details of exactly how much money has been flowing her way for the past 3 years. This includes, Daniel continues, consulting his notes like he's reading stock prices, tuition payments totaling $47,000, living expense supplements of $1,800 monthly, and emergency financial assistance provided on 7 separate occasions. The crowd is starting to murmur now, because $47,000 in tuition payments doesn't come from part-time consulting work. Clara's law school friends are looking at her with expressions that range from confusion to dawning comprehension that maybe they don't know as much about her financial situation as they thought. Second, Daniel says, pulling out another set of documents. We have the revocation of rental guarantees and property support currently being provided to Mr. Marcus Ward. Marcus has stopped grinning entirely now. What the hell are you talking about? I'm talking about the anonymous payments that have been covering your gambling debts, Mr. Ward. $15,000 over the past 18 months, routed through intermediary accounts to protect the identity of the benefactor. The silence in that ballroom is so complete you could perform surgery. Marcus is staring at the papers Daniel just handed him like they're written in a foreign language, probably because his brain can't process the concept that the man he just slapped has been bankrolling his lifestyle. Furthermore, Daniel announces, Mr. Holt has instructed me to inform you that all financial support previously extended to the Ward family, including medical bill assistance, emergency loan payments, and property maintenance contributions, is hereby terminated effective immediately. Clara's mother actually gasps. Her father is gripping the back of a chair like he needs the support to remain standing. The crowd of graduation party guests has transformed into an audience for the most expensive family drama any of them will ever witness. But Daniel's not finished. He pulls out one final document, the piece de resistance that's going to turn this evening from embarrassing to absolutely nuclear. And finally, he says, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, Mr. Holt has revised his will and testament. All assets previously designated for members of the Ward family have been redirected to established charities supporting senior citizens and at-risk youth. The gasps that ripple through the crowd sound like air being let out of a balloon. Clara drops into a chair like her legs have stopped working. Marcus is staring at me with an expression of complete incomprehension, like I've just revealed that I'm actually an alien from outer space. For the first time in 3 years, I step forward and speak clearly, loudly, so that every single person in that ballroom can hear me. Respect, I say, looking directly at Marcus, is earned, not demanded. And then I smile, because sometimes the best revenge is just telling the truth. You know what's funny about dropping a nuclear bomb on someone's life? The radiation takes a while to settle, but when it does, you really get to see who people are when they're backed into a corner. The 48 hours after Daniel's little presentation at the Royal Oaks Ballroom were like watching a nature documentary about predators when their food source suddenly disappears. Fascinating, educational, and absolutely vicious. My phone started ringing at 6:30 the next morning, which should have been my first clue that Wednesday was going to be a real treat. Clara's name on the caller ID, probably because she'd spent all night calculating exactly how screwed she was now that her anonymous benefactor had revealed himself and promptly cut off the money supply. "Adrian, we need to talk," she said without even bothering with hello, her voice that special combination of panic and rage that people get when their comfortable lies suddenly become expensive truths. "Actually, Clara, we really don't," I replied, sipping my coffee and enjoying the view from my balcony. The same balcony Marcus had been eyeing like a starving man looking at a steak dinner. "I think Daniel said everything that needed saying last night. You can't be serious about this. Cutting off my tuition? Canceling the rent assistance? Adrian, I'm 2 months away from taking the bar exam." The bar exam that I'd been funding, in an apartment I'd been paying for, while she and her family treated me like their personal disappointment. The irony was so thick you could serve it at dinner parties. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you stood there and watched your brother assault me in front of 130 people, I said, and hung up. She called back immediately. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. By the time she'd left her fifth increasingly hysterical message, I was starting to understand why people pay money to watch reality TV shows. But Clara was just the opening act. Marcus called around noon, and his approach was different. "Listen, you son of a bitch," he started, because apparently 3 years of my financial support hadn't taught him any manners. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this isn't over." "Marcus," I said, putting him on speaker so I could continue reading the newspaper. "The game is absolutely over. You lost. Badly. In public. While wearing a tie I helped pay for. You think you're so smart, don't you? Walking in there with your lawyer, making us all look like idiots. Marcus, you made yourself look like an idiot when you slapped me at your sister's graduation party. I just provided the context that explains why that was such a spectacularly stupid decision." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had that dangerous edge that probably seemed intimidating to people who didn't know he was basically a 35-year-old toddler with impulse control issues. "This isn't just about money, Adrian. You humiliated my family. You think you can just walk away from that? I think I can do whatever I want, actually. It's called being an adult with my own money and my own choices. You should try it sometime." He hung up on me, which was probably for the best, because I was running out of creative ways to explain that actions have consequences. The really fun part started that evening when Clara's parents decided to stage their own intervention. They showed up at my building lobby around 7, probably figuring they could corner me in person and guilt me into reversing my decision. Patricia was doing that wounded bird thing she's perfected over the years, while Robert looked like a man who'd just discovered his safety net was made of tissue paper. "Adrian, please," Patricia said when the doorman called up to announce them. "We just want to talk." "5 minutes. Mrs. Ward," I said into the lobby phone. "With all due respect, your family had 3 years to talk to me like I was a human being instead of a wallet with legs. That opportunity has officially expired. But Robert's medical bills are Robert's responsibility. Just like Marcus's gambling debts are Marcus's responsibility, and Clara's student loans are Clara's responsibility. Funny how that works." I hung up and watched from my 14th floor window as they stood outside my building for another 20 minutes, probably trying to figure out their next move. Spoiler alert, there wasn't one. Thursday brought a new development that was both predictable and absolutely hilarious. Daniel called to inform me that Marcus had retained a lawyer, apparently someone he'd found on late-night television, and was threatening to file a petition claiming I was mentally unstable and had been manipulated into making reckless financial decisions. "Let me get this straight," I said, laughing so hard I nearly choked on my morning coffee. "The man who publicly assaulted me at a law school graduation party wants to question my mental stability." "That's essentially the argument, yes," Daniel said, and I could hear the amusement in his voice. "His attorney is claiming that your sudden withdrawal of financial support indicates possible cognitive impairment or undue influence." The sheer audacity was breathtaking. Marcus had spent 3 years mocking my intelligence, my career prospects, and my general worthiness as a human being. But now that the money was gone, suddenly I was a vulnerable victim who needed legal protection from my own decisions. "Please tell me you're recording these conversations," I said. "I'm documenting everything," Daniel assured me, including the fact that Mr. Ward's new legal representation specializes in personal injury claims and has never handled a competency case. "How's their success rate?" "Well, their most recent case involved suing a restaurant because a client spilled hot coffee on himself while trying to take a selfie." "Perfect." Marcus had managed to find the legal equivalent of a participation trophy, which was honestly the most Marcus thing he could have done. But the best part: while Marcus was busy planning his legal strategy, I was already 3 moves ahead. Daniel had been gathering evidence for months: financial records, communication logs, documentation of every single anonymous payment, and mysterious bill resolution that had kept the Ward family afloat. "Daniel," I said, "I think it's time we showed them what a real legal strategy looks like." And that's when the fun really began. You know what they say about the best-laid plans of mice and men? Well, Marcus Ward is definitely more mouse than man, and his plan to paint me as mentally incompetent was about as well laid as a house of cards in a hurricane. 3 weeks after his brilliant legal strategy kicked into gear, I found myself sitting in a courtroom watching his bargain basement attorney try to convince a judge that the guy who'd been secretly funding an entire family's lifestyle for 3 years was suddenly too unstable to manage his own finances. The assault charges I filed were pretty straightforward: battery in front of witnesses, with photographic evidence of my bruised cheek and broken glasses. Marcus's lawyer, a guy named Peterson who looked like he'd gotten his law degree from a Cracker Jack box, tried to argue that it was a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by emotional distress over his brother-in-law's erratic behavior. Erratic behavior. That was their defense for Marcus slapping me in public. Apparently, refusing to hand over my apartment keys to a grown man with the financial planning skills of a lottery ticket was considered erratic in the Marcus Ward School of Reasonable Human Interaction. "Your Honor," Peterson said, consulting notes that looked like they'd been written on napkins, "my client was responding to increasingly unstable demands from Mr. Holt, who had been making concerning statements about property ownership and family obligations." Daniel stood up with the kind of smooth confidence that comes from actually knowing what you're doing. "Your Honor, if I may present Exhibits A through Z, which document every financial transaction between Mr. Holt and the defendant's family over the past 3 years. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Coleman, who looked like she'd seen every variety of human stupidity and wasn't impressed by any of it, accepted the thick folder of evidence with raised eyebrows. "Mr. Peterson," she said after flipping through about 10 pages, "are you seriously arguing that your client was justified in assaulting someone who had been anonymously paying his debts?" Peterson's face went through several interesting color changes. "Well, Your Honor, we weren't aware of the full extent of, that is to say, the financial arrangements weren't clearly communicated. So your client slapped someone for refusing to give him an apartment, without knowing that same person had been covering his gambling debts for 18 months. That's technically accurate. Yes, Your Honor." Judge Coleman looked like she was trying not to laugh. "Mr. Ward, please stand." Marcus stood up wearing a suit that was probably more expensive than my car. Another delicious irony, considering who'd been indirectly funding his wardrobe choices. He had that deer-in-headlights expression that people get when reality finally catches up with their poor life decisions. "Mr. Ward, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Marcus opened his mouth, probably planning some eloquent explanation about family dynamics and misunderstandings, but what came out was, "I didn't know he had money." The courtroom went silent. Even his own lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and hide. Judge Coleman stared at Marcus like he'd just confessed to believing the earth was flat. "You didn't know he had money," she repeated slowly. "So you assaulted him because you thought he was poor?" "No, I mean, that's not. I was trying to help him by slapping him and demanding his keys." Marcus realized he was digging his own grave and tried to backtrack. "Your Honor, it's complicated. Family situations are always..." "Mr. Ward, I'm going to stop you right there before you say something even stupider." Judge Coleman turned to her clerk. "Guilty on all counts. Fines totaling $1,500, community service, and a restraining order prohibiting contact with Mr. Holt." But here's where the story gets really interesting. Someone in that courtroom, probably one of Clara's law school friends who'd witnessed the original slapping incident, had been recording the proceedings on their phone. By that evening, the video was all over social media with captions like, "Man discovers he's been slapping his own benefactor," and "When keeping it real goes wrong," legal edition. The internet, in all its chaotic glory, decided that Marcus Ward was the perfect symbol of entitled family members who bite the hand that feeds them. The hashtag Marcus Ward moment started trending, referring to situations where people attack someone who's been helping them without their knowledge. But it was the follow-up interview requests that really caught my attention. Local news stations, morning talk shows, even a producer from one of those daytime TV programs that specializes in family drama. Everyone wanted to hear from the quiet husband who'd been secretly funding his own humiliation for 3 years. That I accepted an interview with Channel 7's morning show, mostly because their anchor, Rebecca Martinez, had a reputation for letting people tell their stories without turning everything into a Jerry Springer episode. "So, Adrian," she said, sitting across from me in their studio, "what made you decide to keep your financial support secret for so long?" "Honestly, Rebecca, I thought I was being generous. I thought I was helping my wife focus on her education and supporting her family during difficult times. I didn't realize I was funding my own mistreatment." The videos from the courtroom have sparked a lot of conversation about family dynamics and financial abuse. Do you see yourself as a victim? I thought about that for a moment, looking directly into the camera. I see myself as someone who learned an expensive lesson about respect. My mistake wasn't helping my family financially. It was accepting their contempt as the price of admission to their lives. The interview went viral. Within a week, I was getting messages from men and women across the country sharing their own stories of family members who took their generosity for granted while treating them like failures. Apparently, being the family ATM while getting treated like the family disappointment was more common than anyone wanted to admit. Clara tried to reach out after the interview aired, sending long text messages about misunderstandings and how we could work things out. I blocked her number. Marcus's restraining order violations, apparently he couldn't resist leaving angry voicemails, earned him additional fines and more community service. But the best part? The Ward family's reputation in Clara's professional circles was absolutely destroyed. Nothing kills a legal career faster than being associated with someone who commits assault on video and then tries to claim the victim was mentally incompetent. Sometimes the best revenge really is just telling the truth and letting other people draw their own conclusions. 6 months after Marcus redecorated my face with his palm, I was sitting in a conference room that didn't smell like broken dreams and family dysfunction, surrounded by people who actually gave a damn about something bigger than themselves. Funny how getting publicly humiliated can be the best thing that ever happens to you, assuming you're smart enough to learn from it instead of just wallowing in self-pity like a country music song. The whole foundation for family integrity started as an angry idea scribbled on a napkin at 3 in the morning, but by spring it had become something real: offices downtown, actual staff, and a mission statement that didn't make me want to throw up from embarrassment. We help people who've been financially manipulated by family members, which turns out to be way more common than anyone wants to admit. Apparently, the world is full of Marcus Wards looking for their next meal ticket, and my neighbor Samuel Brooks became our first official hire, mostly because he's a retired teacher who knows how to explain complicated things without making people feel stupid. At 72, Sam has this way of talking to our clients that makes them feel heard instead of judged, which is exactly what people need when they're dealing with relatives who've been treating them like human ATMs. The thing about family financial abuse, Sam told our latest group therapy session, is that it comes wrapped in love and guilt and obligation. Nobody wants to admit their own brother is basically a con artist with shared DNA. Maya Lewis joined us after Clara's law school friends started treating her like she had some kind of contagious stupidity by association. Maya's brilliant with research and has this gift for tracking down financial paper trails that would make forensic accountants weep with joy. She helped us recover over $200,000 in the first 6 months alone. Money that families thought was gone forever, taken by relatives who assumed generosity was the same thing as stupidity. The book happened almost by accident. Publishers started calling after the interview went viral, wanting me to write some kind of self-help memoir about standing up to toxic family members. The slap that changed everything ended up being part cautionary tale, part instruction manual for recognizing financial manipulation, and part love letter to anyone who's ever been told they should be grateful for being treated like garbage by people who share their last name. Every penny of the book proceeds goes straight to the foundation, because the last thing I need is more money. What I needed was purpose, and apparently getting slapped in public was exactly the wake-up call required to find it. Clara sent a letter 6 months after the divorce was finalized, asking if I missed her. I wrote back with the truth. I miss who I thought you were. Because sometimes honesty really is the best policy. 2 years later, I'm sitting on the same balcony that Marcus coveted like a hungry dog eyeing a bone, watching the city lights flicker to life as the sun sets behind buildings that represent other people's dreams and ambitions. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm still in the apartment he demanded, except now it feels like home instead of a fortress I had to defend against my own family. Marcus works odd jobs now, delivery driver, part-time retail, whatever he can find that doesn't require character references or background checks that might reveal his spectacular fall from grace. His reputation preceded him around town like a bad smell, thanks to the viral videos and social media infamy that follows you when you become the poster child for entitled family stupidity. Last I heard, he was living in his parents' basement, which would be poetic justice if it wasn't so pathetically predictable. Clara lasted exactly 8 months after the foundation launched before reality caught up with her student loans and living expenses. She's back with her parents now, working as a paralegal for a firm that specializes in personal injury cases, probably the only place that would hire someone whose family drama went viral for all the wrong reasons. She still blames me for ruining her future, which is rich considering I spent 3 years funding that future while she practiced looking embarrassed about my existence. She wrote me one last letter about 6 months ago. Don't you miss me? Don't you miss what we had? My response was honest, maybe brutally so. I miss who I thought you were. I don't miss who you actually turned out to be. Because here's the thing about personal growth. Sometimes it requires admitting that the person you loved was mostly a figment of your imagination, a projection of who you hoped they could be instead of who they actually were. Clara wasn't evil, she was just weak, and I spent 3 years enabling that weakness while pretending it was love. The foundation now operates 4 centers across the state, helping dozens of families recognize and escape financial manipulation. We've recovered over $1 million in fraudulent transfers, helped people establish boundaries with toxic relatives, and created support networks for anyone who's ever been told they should be grateful for being treated like garbage by people who supposedly love them. That I don't hate the Ward family anymore. I've simply outgrown them. Hate requires energy and emotional investment, and I'd rather spend both on people who deserve them. My life is full now, meaningful in ways I never expected when I was playing the role of the disappointing husband who should be thankful for any attention at all. Every night, I sit on this balcony and remember Marcus's slap, not as the worst moment of my life, but as the beginning of my real life. Sometimes the best gift someone can give you is showing you exactly who they are when they think you can't fight back. Turns out, I could fight back just fine. I just needed the right motivation.